Okay, now I can hear you. So are we ready? It is now 9 o'clock.
Are we waiting on Dawn?
Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
And I know Don's coming, but he had a late flight last night, so he may be running a few minutes late.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Chair.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, September 22nd. Welcome to the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. It is a hybrid meeting. I'm actually broadcasting remotely, but the in-person meeting is actually taking place at the Library Galleria at the East Room at 821 I Street in downtown Sacramento. Again, welcome to everybody. And I am actually working remotely today, or doing this meeting remotely out of an abundance of caution. I have twin sons, one who had COVID last week and one son who tested positive and actually is very sick. And he's upstairs. So I've been around him and I just didn't want to take that chance. So I'm broadcasting from my office. Again, welcome. If you would please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We will now establish a quorum, and I'll start with a roll call. Councilmember Damrell. Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Natoli.
Here.
Councilmember Smith. I don't see Christy. Does anybody know if she's signed in?
She's in the closed session already, so we're trying to.
Okay. Okay. Councilmember Zingali.
Yes, I'm here.
And Councilmember Medueno here. We are now going to, and I should note, Councilmember Zingali is also participating remotely, as is Councilmember Smith. We are now going to go into closed session, under Water Code Section 85210.5. We expect to return at 10 a.m. So we will now, again, go to closed session. If you are in the room, we ask that you please take your belongings with you as you exit. And again, we will be back at 10 a.m. from closed session.
We should be good to go, Madam Chair.
Okay, excellent. Okay, welcome back to the Delta Stewardship Council meeting. Again, today is Thursday, September 21st, and we are reconvening after closed session. Again, it is now 10 a.m. and there is nothing to report out of closed session. We will now reestablish our quorum. We'll start with Councilmember Damrell. I can't hear you, but I can see you, Judge. Councilmember Lee. Uh-oh, we're having a little bit of audio.
Here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Councilmember Natoli.
Here.
Councilmember Smith. Councilmember Zingali. I do believe Councilmember Zingali was going to take a needed to take a short break, so we'll reconvene with him once he joins us, I believe at 11 a.m. Councilmember Smith, are you there? Councilmember Madueño here. Do we know if Christy is going to join? And
We're checking on that right now, Madam Chair.
okay. But I do believe we do have a quorum with those of us present. Is that correct?
That is correct, Madam Chair.
Okay.
That's 4 members.
Okay, perfect. So if it's okay, I say we continue on and we'll have Councilmember Smith join us as soon as she can. At this time, if any member of the public is interested in providing public comment on any agenda item during today's meeting, please turn in or send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to speak on. When called, either approach the podium or the clerk will unmute you. We will now move on to the consent calendar. And is there an approval of the consent calendar?
Motion to approve.
Seconded by Natoli.
Moved by Councilmember Lee, a second by Councilmember Natoli. Are there any public comments on the items on the consent calendar?
No, Madam Chair, there are not.
Members of the council, is there any need for any discussion on items of the consent calendar? If not, there is a motion to accept the consent calendar and a second, again by Councilmember Lee and a Councilmember by Natoli, and we'll now do a vote. Councilmember Damrell.
Damrell here. Aye.
Councilmember Lee.
Aye.
Councilmember Natoli.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
Aye.
Councilmember Madueño. Aye. We will now move on to the chair's report, and I've got a few items that I wanted to share with you. First, I'll start with a trip that I took to Los Angeles last week to meet with Barbara Romero, who is the head of Los Angeles City Water and Sanitation. Come to find out, Barbara and I actually have, we established a connection. She and I went through the same leadership program years ago through HOPE. It was a very good meeting, a very positive and engaging meeting, and told her that the council looked forward to hearing from her at our October meeting. She did talk about some of the new technologies that they're putting into place for the city of Los Angeles with regard to more recycling and creating, again, a robust water system that can and will sustain the city of Los Angeles for years to come. She talked on the issue of equity and how important it is for the city to make sure that, again, they have a healthy supply of water for generations again to come, and that it is equitable. Following that meeting, I had a meeting with Mark Pistrella with the County of Los Angeles. He is actually the Public Works Director. Again, a very good meeting, positive. Told Mark Pistrella that we look forward to hearing more from him at our next council meeting in October. Again, want to hear more about some of the new infrastructure that they are putting into place in the County of Los Angeles. I did tell him, with all kidding aside, I said, you know, when I travel throughout the Delta, I would say that 9 out of 10 times, most people tell me to tell the people of Southern California that they need to do more with and not take so much water away from Northern California. And so, of course, that was the gist of it, but we do obviously take that sentiment to heart. Mark Pistrella was very straightforward. And again, he welcomes us to come and take a tour of some of the infrastructure projects that they are implementing in the County of Los Angeles. And you'll be hearing more from him in our October meeting. I will be actually speaking at the Science for Communities workshop on October the 6th. I think that's an excellent opportunity to hear more from the community about how science impacts day-to-day, if you will, activities. And given the impact with the algal blooms, it becomes a topic of essential and critical importance for so many in the Delta and throughout the Delta. Also, I did my monthly recap to the Independent Science Board. I thanked outgoing chair, Dr. Stephen Brandt, and again, thanked him for his service and acknowledged again what a great opportunity it was to work with him, even though it was for a short time, and also, of course, welcome Dr. Lisa Wenger, who is the new chair moving forward. Gave them a quick recap of our last meeting and especially asked them to look at the recording and pay in particular attention to our EJ expert group portion of the meeting, which I thought was incredibly welcoming and again, a good time for them to see some of the critical aspects of the work that we are embarking on. We have also shared with them a little bit about DPIC and our refocus and recharged energy, if you will, moving forward with DPIC with the great leadership of Amanda Bull and the team. So that was well received. I've actually just been asked by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to have a conversation with them about this refocus on Friday. And as my commitment as chair, I always believe it's important to be out in the community, meeting and talking with members of the community, the business community, the general public. And so I went out on the Delta yesterday. Of course, I always take the train, and stopped in Antioch, stopped in Martinez, spoke with some fishermen there outside of the marina, and talked about, you know, what is it that they have seen change and what would they like to see as we, the stewards of the council, and our pledge in terms of serving the community, what would they like to see more? It was actually quite interesting to hear them say, wow, we've never heard anybody come out and speak to us on behalf of the Delta. And so it's been great meeting with members again of just the general public, those that fish, those that have seen a tremendous change in their fishing activities, and members of the business community that have businesses in and around and adjacent to the Delta. So I continue to have that pledge to go out there as regularly as possible. And let's see if there's anything else I wanted to share with you. Oh, one last thing, and I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, but we did get our first briefing on the Delta Conveyance project from Secretary Crowfoot. This was last Monday. I thank Secretary Crowfoot for the opportunity to have this open discussion. I learned quite a bit. I think it's one of many conversations that we need to have. And so I shared with Secretary Crowfoot how important these meetings are for us as a council, for our team members. And so he welcomed that and said his pledge was to create more opportunities for us to have that space to have these discussions and hear more about what they are working on. And with that, I will now move it to the rest of the council. If there's any member of the council, Councilmember Natoli.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilmember Natoli.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for your ongoing work, certainly to advance the work of the Stewardship Council, but also I think to outreach and get acquainted with certainly the folks that are directly part of the Delta, but also with folks who have influence and impact as it relates to agencies and other organizations. I did want to note that I know that I think actually our paths crossed that evening, but you had been early at the reception for the Delta Regional Foundation, which they honored the Delta Champions. It had been an event that had been postponed a couple different times due to some of the COVID restrictions, but it was an outstanding event held in the community of Thornton, and I recognized, again, some organizations and individuals who over time have contributed in a variety of ways to to the work and daily life in the Delta, but also in supporting activities and initiatives that are important to the long-term health and vibrancy of the Delta. So I did want to acknowledge that, and it was an outstanding event. I also wanted to note, and I know you referenced it, I'm sure Dr. Larson and others, and Jesse will talk about the conference on October 6th, but I plan on being there as well. It looks to be something that I think will be helpful in advancing discussions about the algal blooms, but certainly to the health of the Delta. And I appreciate all the effort that goes into something like that. And we'll look forward to that. I also wanted to note, just as you referenced in your comments, getting a brief from Secretary Crowfoot on the Conveyance project, that the Delta Protection Commission has sent communications to Director Nemeth and to Secretary Crowfoot as relates to the hearings. There's actually one that's going to occur today while this body is in session, virtual hearings related to the environmental document, which was issued in late July, and the comment period extends through October. There have also been requests by interested parties in the Delta, including some of the counties and the commission, seeking additional time. It's a very voluminous document. And but I did want to note that one of the concerns, and I think it's appropriate to note it before this body, that has been expressed, is the fact that all the hearings, one that occurred last week, one that will occur next week, and the one today, are all being done virtually. And the point that we've made is that the impacts are not virtual; they're going to be very real, whether people assess those impacts to be good or bad, and that there should be a hearing in the Delta. And I know this council certainly has worked very hard to have our meetings, over time, as we're able to come together, certainly, during the pandemic, but hopefully post-pandemic, to advance, I think, the ability for folks to be in conversation with us, to have access to our meetings. And certainly the virtual environment provides folks who may not be able to travel to a fixed location. But we're very concerned that the hearings are being conducted during the harvest season, reflecting on, obviously, one of the primary activities in the Delta being agriculture, and makes it difficult for landowners and farmers and others associated with agriculture to, and when Wi-Fi is sketchy, that's the other point we made. We know that in some of those communities, Wi-Fi access is minimal at best. And so I just wanted to point out that we continue to express concerns on behalf of the commission, and certainly in the counties, and I know other entities, asking for at least one hearing in person in the Delta as relates to the comments on the draft EIR for the Delta Conveyance proposal. And that's all I had. Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you, Councilmember Natoli. And I definitely want to, again, just redirect. The Delta Champions event was absolutely, as you pointed out, an incredible opportunity to recognize and honor those that have made so much contributions, have made so many contributions to the Delta. In particular, I went and introduced myself to Dr. Go, who I didn't recognize because I didn't see a photo of him, but when I saw him and met him, I was, number one, surprised of the age that they said he had, but more impressed at the fact that he is still practicing 2 to 3 days per week, which I was just floored. Unfortunately, I didn't get to break bread. I had to catch a flight to LA that night, but it was great to see and meet, go out and meet individuals and let them know that we as the council, yes, we are very much vested in wanting to hear and learn more from the community. And I would actually have to echo your sentiment, and I did share some of that in the briefing to those that represented the Department of Water Resources and Secretary Crowfoot. I do believe, as somebody who does outreach and has done outreach for over 20 years, and that being my profession, it is absolutely essential that the outreach component does include in person. It does include, again, a scale of outreach that includes all, and not those that just have the means to be able to communicate through a virtual mechanism, which many do not. And so I hope that they do take that to heart and do have the commitment to go out and do an in-person hearing. I think it's absolutely essential, and doing it in at least one or two other languages. With that, I'll let Councilmember Lee, anything you'd like to share with us today?
Nothing today, thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Nothing today, thank you, Madam Chair.
Judge Damrell, Councilmember Damrell, anything you'd like to share? Okay. Hearing no other comments, we will now move on to the chair's report. And for that, we have our distinguished executive director, Ms. Jessica Pearson.
I just got promoted. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone, and happy first day of fall. And since I just got back from North Carolina, I think I'm supposed to add y'all to that. So it's nice to see the change in season and a little bit of precipitation here in Sacramento. I'm going to begin with a few announcements. First, as was already touched upon earlier by council members, we do have an upcoming Science for Communities workshop that's going to be held on October 6th from 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. at the Big Break Center in Oakley. This is a workshop to boost the Delta community's awareness and access to the environmental data and technical tools that are available to them, and to foster interaction between scientists and community members looking to get more engaged. The program for the upcoming workshop was released earlier this week and includes panel discussions with scientists and community organizations, an opportunity to learn about the Council's Environmental Justice Initiative, and a tour of the Big Break Regional Shoreline. Registration is still open and information can be found on our website. And as Councilmember Natoli mentioned, the Department of Water Resources is holding a couple of virtual public hearings on the Delta Conveyance Project Draft EIR. One is today from 12 to 2, and there's information on DWR's website. And there's another one coming up on September 28th, that is 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. On the topic of covered actions, last month I reported on the opening of the review period for Reclamation District 348 certification of consistency for the South McCullummy River Setback Levee Project. The proposed project's review period closed on September 12th with no appeals, and the project may now proceed. On behalf of the council, staff sent 3 comment letters this past month that are available in your packets. The first letter is to the Department of Water Resources regarding the draft environmental impact report for the West False River Drought Salinity Barrier Project, which seeks to minimize impacts of salinity intrusion into the Delta. This project specifically seeks a long-term permit to construct a barrier when necessary during exceptional droughts, rather than relying on emergency petitions that have been used in recent years. The council's letter state that the project appears to be a covered action, and we identify several applicable Delta Plan policies concerning mitigation measures, best available science, risk reduction, and local land use considerations for the project. The second letter is to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board regarding the PEIR for the Yolo Bypass Cash Slough Partnership Multi-Benefit Program Master Plan. The master plan seeks to support projects that provide flood capacity, enhance habitat, and preserve agricultural land in support of the priorities of the Yolo Bypass Cash Slough Partnership. The proposed program appears to meet the definition of a covered action, and the letter identifies applicable Delta Plan policies concerning ecosystem restoration, local land use, and flood risk reduction. The last letter is to the State Water Resources Control Board regarding the notice of preparation of an EIR for the lower San Joaquin River and Southern Delta portions of their Bay Delta plan. This is the regulatory and programmatic implementation plan for water quality objectives in the Delta. The Water Board intends to adopt regulations to allocate responsibility to water rights holders for implementing the lower San Joaquin River flow and Southern Delta salinity components of the 2018 update to the plan. And while the update to the Bay Delta plan is not a covered action, future actions taken to meet standards may be. The comment letter to the board strongly supports the implementation of the Bay Delta plan and its updates as outlined in the Delta plan. And the letter also comments on the adaptive management components and extended drought considerations of the plan. As these projects and plans progress, we'll provide updates, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. In personnel, I'm excited to share the hiring of our new Deputy Executive Officer for Science, Henry DeVay. Henry's here in the audience today. Henry has been the Environmental Program Manager for our Collaborative Science and Peer Review Unit at the Delta Science Program since 2020. He has spent over a dozen years working at the intersection of environmental science and policy, including with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. He has a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Yale and a Bachelor of Science in Geography and Environmental Studies from UCLA. Henry's passionate about science communication and working with diverse stakeholders to tackle these complex science governance challenges that we find ourselves facing, and I look forward to working with him in his new role. So congratulations to Henry. Included in your board packet, per usual, are your outreach highlights report and your active projects lists. If you have any questions about any items on there, please let me know. And today, for the first time in a long time, we have a legislative update in honor of the end of session. And this is Brandon's first opportunity to be before you in his new role. So thank you, Brandon.
Get to grab a name tag for the first time rather than supplying them. Good morning, Good morning, members. Just a quick legislative update this morning. For those that have been following, the legislature finished its business at the end of last month and is now in recess until December. Before they left, however, they sent hundreds of bills to the governor, who now has until September 30th to sign or veto each of them. The one bill of interest today that I'll highlight is Senate Bill 905 by Senator Caballero and Skinner. This is on page 7 of the bill report, if you have it in front of you. The report notes that this is awaiting signature, but this was actually signed by the governor late last week. This was part of the governor's climate package with the intent to expedite the permitting process for carbon capture and sequestration projects. By specifically charging the Air Resources Board in consultation with any other permitting or approving agencies or entities to establish regulations for a unified permitting process for those type of projects. The anticipated completion date for that, or the requirement, is by January 1st, 2025. And a program is not to be developed to avoid any obligations of any projects. It's more to just make it, to try to make efficiencies of the permitting process. Moving forward, council staff will be monitoring how the Air Resources Board implements this new unified program as it relates to the legal delta, and will provide updates when appropriate. The rest of the bills we are tracking are available in your report in writing. However, I will note that AB 2108, which in your report states that it's still awaiting signature by the governor, was actually also signed last week after the production of that report.
Which one was 2108?
AB 2108 is from Assemblymember Rivas. It's regarding environmental justice. I believe that one's on page 2. Thank you, members. That's all I have for today. Like I said, a very short report, and I'll pass it back over to Jessica unless there's any questions.
Good job on your first time report there.
Thank you.
Very concise. Thanks.
Yeah, quick and to the point.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thanks.
Okay, well, on the agenda today, we will hear from the Delta Watermaster for his regular update on his office's activities. And then after lunch at 1 o'clock, we will conduct a public workshop to provide an overview and hear input on the council's administrative procedures governing appeals for covered actions. So, Chair, that concludes my report. Happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so very much, Jessica. Excellent report. Two things I want to highlight. One is my dismissal of public comment on my report, and also to announce the public comment period. And again, if there is a member of the public who would like to comment on any topic not on the council's agenda, any comments on the items on the agenda will be taken during that time. But I wanted to make sure that If there was somebody from the public that would like to make public comment on any item not on the agenda, this would be a good time, and then we'll take public comment on the chair's report and the executive officer's report. Beck, is there any public comment?
No, Madam Chair, there is not on either item.
Okay, great. And one last thing to wrap up. Thank you, Brandon, for sharing that legislative report. I also dismissed the other key item that I wanted to bring to the council's agenda, and that is I was invited to attend a environmental justice meeting with the EPA Western Regional Director in Stockton. I thought that was very interesting that they're having a meeting. It sounds like it's going to be incredibly focused on carbon capture, sequestration, as well as some other environmental issues in and around the Delta, and in particular with Stockton being the focus. So I'll be attending that on September the 29th. If there is no other public comment, members of the council, any questions, comments? Okay. We will now move on to the lead scientist report. And for that, we have Dr. Laurel Larson. Good morning, Laurel. How are you?
Good morning. Doing well. Thank you. And good morning to all of the council members. First of all, I'll say, wow, there's a lot going on between the rain that we just got, a plethora of upcoming fall workshops, and the recent harmful algal bloom event in the Bay that I trust you all have heard about. And it's actually the latter, harmful algal blooms, or HABs as I'll call them through this report, that will be the theme of my presentation today. As you will shortly learn from Pascal Gertler here in front of you, a senior environmental scientist from the Delta Science Program, who I'm going to invite to speak to you shortly. The red tide event that just happened in the Bay is a different type of HABs than the type that we get in the Delta. Unlike the Bay event, the organisms that comprise HABs in the Delta are cyanobacteria, most commonly microcystis, and they produce a neurotoxin called microcystin. In contrast, the red tide event in the Bay was composed of a different class of microorganism, rhapidophytes, which is a type of protists with flagella that allow them to swim up and down in the water column. They're in a genus called Heterosigma, and while they're known to be toxic to fish, their toxin has not yet been isolated and their mechanism of toxicity is poorly understood. Of course, they also drive dissolved oxygen in the water column to very low levels, which is what resulted in the fish kill that we just saw in the Bay. While red tide events have occurred infrequently in the Bay for decades, freshwater cyano-HABs events in the Delta are a recent phenomenon appearing only since 1999, and they have been increasing in frequency and extent. Cyano-HABs are also poorly understood in tidal systems compared to marine HABs or to cyano-HABs events in freshwater lakes. And hence, two actions in the 2022 to 2026 Science Action Agenda focus on elucidating how they occur and what we could do to decrease their probability of occurrence and or lessen their impacts. The article that I'm going to spotlight today, and I'll thank Elise Shabbat, Tate Pulliam, our state fellow, for putting together the graphic. This article addresses one of those actions in the Science Action Agenda, determine how environmental drivers interact to cause HABs in the Delta. The article is led by Peggy Lehman at the Department of Water Resources and evaluates how temperature and flows interact in the formation of HABs blooms. It is generally understood that these blooms tend to develop under warmer temperatures, elevated concentrations of nutrients in the water, a relatively stagnant or slow-flowing water that enables colonies to form. But how those factors interact and how they quantitatively relate to bloom characteristics, as well as what triggers particular blooms, remain poorly understood. In this study, Lehman and the team took advantage of a weather whiplash event, a transition between the extreme drought of 2012 to 2016 and the extreme wet year in 2017, to evaluate how contrasting abiotic conditions, namely the extreme contrast in flows, might explain differences in the abundance of microcystis across those years. So they sampled water for microcystis throughout extremely dry 2014 and extremely wet 2017. And actually, I just realized this slide is not the one I wanted to show for this article. It's the other slide. Yeah, they sampled water for microcystis throughout the extremely dry 2014 and extremely wet 2017, while also tracking flows, different water quality constituents, including nutrients and temperature. Given that in another wet year, 2011, there was virtually no microcystis present, the team hypothesized that cyanoHABs are reversible with high flows. However, this was not what they saw. Instead, microcystis remained present through wet 2017, though the bloom was smaller, initiated later, had a shorter duration, and produced fewer toxins than in dry 2014, when the delta experienced a bloom that was 13 to 76% larger than in all previous years. The team concluded that once microcystis is established during dry years, seed material is retained and blooms will likely persist even during subsequent very wet years, provided that water temperature and other water quality factors are favorable. Another contribution of this study is that the team used statistical modeling to relate the data that they had collected on microcystis concentration in the water to the other abiotic data that they collected. And interestingly, they found that just two variables could explain most of the variability in microcystis concentration during those bloom events. Now, one of those variables is X2. This is a term that you might hear scientists talk about a lot. You could think of it as an integrative measure that is sensitive to delta outflows and tides. It's called X2 because it represents the distance into the delta at which the bottom salinity is 2 parts per thousand. So it's a measure of how far into the delta that salinity encroaches. During wet years, flows are effective at pushing this salinity transition back towards the Golden Gate, but during dry years, X2 lengthens as the salinity front moves into the delta. Lehman and colleagues found that X2 in combination with water temperature were predictive of the abundance of cyanoHABs organisms. With warmer temperatures and higher X2, representative of lower outflows, associated with more microcystis. So this work suggests that management actions that decrease X2 or decrease that salinity encroachment may be associated with lower probabilities of HABs. And though the data used to form their model were limited, their statistical model, may also provide a quantitative way to estimate possible impacts of altered salinity, which I'm using here as a proxy for flows, on HABs. And this is something that could really benefit the products of the Delta Salinity Management Workshop. So any questions on that particular article before I hand things over to Pascal?
Madam Chair, if I could just ask a question of Dr. Larson.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. So with the scientific data, then would this be shared with those who operate the system, the upstream system, as it relates to releases, flows, timing? Obviously, there's a variety of factors of, that fit in with other biological opinions relative to fish and, and other species there, but recognizing what you've been able to, gather thus far. I found this fascinating. The X2 discussion, I know, in fact, I never quite knew what that related to, but it's 2 parts per trillion?
2 parts per thousand.
Oh, per thousand.
Yeah.
Okay, per thousand.
Yeah.
So will this, again, I mean, it's available publicly, but will this be shared? Because again, along with other factors that fit in with operations of the storage and releases and, different times of the season. And so I'm curious, Dr. Larson, how will this potentially be used, at least in your view?
Yeah, there's a few different ways in which I think this is useful. It's one part of a larger complex story, as you've acknowledged. And I should point out that the data collected only come from 2 years, and so they might not be representative of or predictive of the types of HABs events that occur regularly in the Delta. But that said, I think it could be useful as kind of helping us produce a back of the envelope estimate of how salinity management alternatives that we're looking at in this salinity management workshop could play out for the HABs story. So it's one of the things that could help us estimate the broader trade-offs of our flow management actions. The other thing that this is really relevant to is the upcoming harmful algal blooms workshop in November, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the report. That workshop aims to develop a comprehensive and well-coordinated monitoring strategy for harmful algal blooms. And this report, I think, helps identify what some of the factors that these events are most sensitive to are, which are factors that should be incorporated into a monitoring program in a deliberate way.
And at the risk of certainly being way out of my league on this, but I would just use an example where you predictably knew that you were going to have this run of 110-degree days or average 109 for a better part of a week, and you knew what the flows were in the river. Some of the other predictors of what at least this study and others might show I could see where it could be potentially, again, with pulse release, depending upon tidal flows, where the activity was, whether obviously let's look at the bay as well as the estuary and the river system, where you could, I guess, flush it for lack of a better word, but you'd have to make sure we get out. And again, does this exist in the ocean environment, or is it just isolated to more to the stagnant waters?
So these cyano-HABs events, the cyanobacterial harmful algal bloom events, occur in fresh water, but the toxins are making it out into brackish and salt water, including in the bay. So this truly is an estuary-wide problem of concern. But the mechanisms through which these cyano-HABs blooms form are likely to be different from the mechanisms causing the red tide events in the bay and in oceanic environments. I should also say that, the statistical model that was developed in this study is not something that's predictive of whether a specific bloom will occur at a specific time and place. But I think it is something that is useful for helping us develop hypotheses about impacts of proposed management actions that could then be tested. It's a part of the puzzle. The council has been taking a leadership role in coordinating across agencies in support of monitoring that ultimately will support predictive modeling of these harmful algal bloom events. And I expect that we'll continue to play a role in synthesis of the findings of these emerging studies. And so, I think this is a really important part of the puzzle.
And I guess I would just say, again, from a layperson standpoint, that with predictive modeling, though, that then if you have the ability to counteract or blunt through certain, at least operational aspects, and we're not going to control necessarily the temperature or the tidal flows and so forth, but I think some of the things that could be done that would assist in long term, that would save fish, and it would obviously save some of the other things that occur as bad outcomes because of the blooms. So again, fascinating, and thank you for those that have participated thus far. And it sounds like it's a developing area of information, and but hopefully over time allow us to counteract some of the effects of this in a way that makes sense. So thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you for that discussion. Good discussion to have. Okay, if there aren't further questions from council members, I am going to turn the floor over to Pascal Gertler, Senior Environmental Scientist within the Delta Science Program, for a discussion of the recent event in the Bay, this Heterosigma HAB event, and how the council has been involved in the response to that event.
Perfect.
Thanks, Laurel, and thanks, members, for having me. Could I have those slides back, please? All right, great, thank you. So Laurel already covered this really well, but I'm just gonna go over a few facts here. So the HAB progression happened this August 2022. It was a multi-week harmful algal bloom event, which commonly results from overgrowth of algae or phytoplankton and can produce cyanotoxins, as Laura mentioned. This can affect human health, cause acute and chronic illness, and in some cases mortality, although it didn't in this particular event. It does also result in low dissolved oxygen that can suffocate fish and cause widespread fish mortality, which is what I'm here to talk about. HABs are becoming more frequent and more intense across California, and decreased freshwater flow, warm water, and increased concentrations of nutrients and other land-based pollutants exacerbate the growth of algae and cyanotoxins. This figure here is from the Ocean Protection Council, and it is data from Sentinel-3, which is managed by NOAA. And this is an approximation for chlorophyll presence in the bay. And what I want you to see here is the progression through time. And so the date is at the top of each of these panels, and you can see that it started at Merritt Lake and then extended into the South Bay and then San Pablo as well. And I also want you to notice that the intensity increased through time. Next slide, please. And this resulted, as I mentioned, in low dissolved oxygen and a widespread fish mortality event. So here I'm showing you dissolved organic O2 from the Dunbarton Bridge, which is in South San Francisco Bay. And to give you a sense of a fish's perspective of this dissolved oxygen, I have 3 colored arrows there. So this is milligrams per liter. And so for a fish, if you're around 7, which is where the green arrow is, that's great. That's where you want to be. Once you hit 5 milligrams per liter, which is the yellow arrow, and it also has dashed lines, that is where we start to hit stress for a fish. So imagine any one of us hiking in a high elevation spot. You know, your heart beats a little bit faster, you need to take more breaks. That's where we're entering about 5 milligrams per liter. And then once you get down to 3, that is where we start to see some real damage and mortality event. And as you can see, date is on the x-axis here. We had 3 or 4 days of lethal DO levels with a drop all the way down to 0.5 milligrams per liter on September 1st at 1 p.m., which is a horrific experience if you're an aquatic species that needs to breathe with your gills. This varies by species and condition, obviously, so this is a generalization, but I want to give you a sense of what happened. Next slide, please. Yes, and I doubt that they can actually measure 0, so quite low. I heard anecdotally that clams and invertebrates were also found in large numbers, so it likely killed everything in the water in some places. Yeah, I read a quote that these events are like wildfires underwater, and I think it's a pretty good metaphor, because just like a fire can pull the oxygen out of the air, so too can these HAB events decrease the oxygen in the water.
Does it inhibit their ability to, maybe swim away or to get, I mean, obviously clams and such are, on the bottom. I mean, they can move over time, and you can with obviously other flow of water. But so I would assume, just as you used the human analogy, that as you got winded, your ability to try to escape, if there was, the ability to do so, becomes hampered as well. So is that the case with the fish?
Yes, we believe so. So this is a photo of Mare Island with, those are large white sturgeon there. And sturgeon are a migratory fish, and they can swim quite fast. And we did have some evidence of dead sturgeon on the coasts as well. So maybe they had that stressful experience, tried to leave, and then the amount of damage to their gills was insurmountable, especially since they need to transition into salt water, which is a stressful event in its own right. So we collect fin rays and genetic samples from carcasses when they appear. And this is a photo, like I said, of Mare Island. Those are 3 large white sturgeon there. And the second photo, I'm in it as a size reference, so you can see the size of me and my head in particular compared to the size of that sturgeon's head at my feet. So there's a sturgeon at my feet, and there's also one behind me there. So scientists are working to quantify this fish kill, and I'm part of a collaboration working to estimate estuarine mortality for sturgeon. Sturgeon are a popular recreation fish, and they are long-lived. They can live up to 100 years, we think. They're ancient. They evolved 200 million years ago. And there are two species, white sturgeon, which is a common recreational fish, which is shown here, and then also green sturgeon, which is ESA listed and endemic to our watershed. These particular sturgeon are probably anywhere between 10 and 20 years old, but we collected fin rays, so we'll be able to better estimate their age and life history, as well as make sure we confirm their species. And that is done with a collaboration with Kramer Fish Sciences and UC Davis. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So this effort relies on citizen science. And I think you have our flyer and our stickers. So if you go kayaking or hiking, please let us know if you see any sturgeon carcasses. This is also a list of my collaborators. And I want to mention that this artwork on the sticker was done by Stephanie Littlebird-Fogel, who was a artist in residence at NOAA in 2020. And she made these really beautiful illustrations for us. Yeah, and I will take questions.
If I could, just on your sticker, if you could get some of those to the Delta Protection Commission, and I would think even the Delta Conservancy staff, because again, they have connectivity with community organizations. Obviously, there's a good deal of outreach, but proper placement of these so that folks would know in the event. I guess one would hope this would never happen again, but in the thing to alert folks that we're trying to learn more about what happens and why, but this will help in that effort. So I would just certainly through the commission's activities offer that. Maybe you've already done that, but I would just as a suggestion, they could help with the distribution and whether it's in bait shops or it's in some of the organizations that conduct outings into the obviously the bay, but certainly to the Delta. There are some linkages there I think could assist in the research and identification. I just want to ask one of the questions, and it was your analogy about the wildfires underwater. Is there research going on that, because when you talk about nutrients and some of the impacts, again, whatever those suspended solids are, coming through the system, and when you look at the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta and the upper reaches of those watersheds that have just, burnt to the ground in a lot of cases, and then, but even some of the lower elevations, you look at around Berryessa and the LMU fire and all the bodies of water at some point in time have some connectivity to the two great rivers and the Delta and the estuary. So I'm curious, because it would seem to me that as we're seeing this, that might be an area, again, from a layperson standpoint, that there's research going certainly to the long-term damage to the flora and fauna and the animals that reside there. But then what that may mean when the runoff, because that's what we're seeing, even the event of just a couple of days ago, you had flash flooding in a couple of counties. What gets into the waters and what's residual versus what ends up coming in downstream or settling out in a behind a dam in a storage situation. So again, I know enough to be dangerous if at all, but I would suggest that might be something to take a look at, because again, from the Sierras to the sea, that's the connectivity, and certainly the Delta is a hub of water mixing and movement and so forth. And so I'm curious, is there any research connected to what you're doing or to others looking at some of those other factors?
So our group is trying to look at sturgeon mortality and estuary generally, so the HAB event, but also other causes. Yes. But yes, that's one of the hypotheses that's being pursued, is that nutrients was the reason why this bloom was able to get so big. There's also a few other food web hypotheses relating to anchovy and zooplankton. Or I don't know if you wanted to add.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that the council is seriously considering funding a directed action that I will report on at the end of this report, that looks at some of the wildfire retardants that are being used in the upper watershed and what, if any, toxic effects there might be for fish at environmentally relevant concentrations in the Delta. So that's something that's very much on our radar. That project actually comes out of an IEP working group. And so it's something that the science community has really prioritized and highlighted as an area in need of investigation.
So beyond any natural elements that, charred trees and, all that you're looking at actually during the actual firefight, materials that are used to try to subdue the fire.
yeah, particularly newer materials that are being used prolifically now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Great. But,
Can I?
oh,
can
go
I
ahead. Yes.
Thank you. And great report, Pascal and Laurel, as always. Quick question. When you talk about the fish suffocation, and in particular, we saw these photos of the sturgeons, you said that there might be, or there is more fish that are more susceptible to the HABs. Do we also know which fish are more resilient to the HABs? And the reason why I'm asking this is, as a layperson, when I went from Antioch to Martinez and stopped at the two marinas, that was one of the key questions for me is, do we know which fish are going to be more resilient? The fishermen that I was talking to said that they've seen a huge decline in catfish and trout over the last few years. They mentioned striped bass is coming back, but do we have any studies on which fish are going to be those that are going to be more resilient in what we're seeing right now?
That's a really good question. I think the timing of these events has a big impact on which fish are going to be more resilient. So sturgeon are anadromous, they are highly migratory, and so we would hope that they would be very resilient. But this was particularly bad timing for white sturgeon and maybe not as bad a timing for green. But I definitely see your point. I think estuarine residents may be more vulnerable because they don't move in and out and they don't have that built-in resilience potentially, especially with an event that goes across the entire bay. And there were quite a few striped bass as well. I forgot to mention that with the sturgeon in some of those photos.
Right. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pascal. If there are no further questions for Pascal, I'll move on to other aspects of the report. The next thing that I'd like to report on is actually quite related to what we've just heard. It's somewhat serendipitous that the Delta Science Program was already planning to have a workshop focused on harmful algal blooms on November 8th and 9th. And I think this recent event has just really reinforced to many of the people involved in planning this workshop that these HABs events are an estuary-wide problem, not a bay-specific problem or a delta-specific problem. And one of the connections across those boundaries that has really emerged as important in this recent hetero sigma event is consideration of how nutrients contributed by wastewater treatment plants within the bay versus what's coming in from the delta might have fueled this bloom. And I think I've mentioned that we don't know what triggered this bloom, but there are questions about the roles of nutrients in that triggering. As you know, the Sacramento Regional Sanitation District recently upgraded its treatment systems to tertiary treatment, which removes the majority of nitrogen from its effluent. Most of the water treatment systems in the bay stop at secondary treatment, and so they still have large ammonium loads into the bay. And there are questions about whether, at the cost of billions of dollars, those treatment plants would need to undergo similar upgrading processes. There's also questions about the extent to which clearing water columns, which has happened naturally as the hydraulic mining pulse of sediment has subsided, but also happens as a result of invasive aquatic weeds trapping sediment and invasive clams also trapping sediment. Anyway, there's questions about the extent to which this water column clearing might have contributed to this bloom event. And so all of these questions really require coordination and transfer of scientific understanding across that Bay Delta interface. And so what that has meant for the harmful algal bloom workshop planning is that the team is in the process of reaching out to some of the researchers who research harmful algal bloom events in the Bay. And the breakout discussions will focus not just on how we might coordinate a monitoring program within the Delta, but how how that Delta specific monitoring program, which is an intended outcome of this workshop, will interact with the HABs monitoring that's done within the Bay. So workshop registration for the harmful algal blooms workshop is now open. It is a hybrid event, meaning that there are in-person slots available, but also unlimited virtual slots. So if you are interested in attending, or if you have constituents who are interested in attending, please refer them to a recent council listserv that announced that registration, and it's also in your packet. There are many other noteworthy workshops in the even nearer term horizon than that harmful algal blooms workshop. Earlier, you heard JP report on the Science for Communities workshop. And again, we're delighted to have Virginia Medueno as a plenary speaker for that workshop. I don't think I'll say anything more about that. And then shortly after the Science for Communities workshop is a workshop series that's being put on by the Delta Social Science Community of Practice. And that workshop is a two-part workshop occurring on two separate dates, October 14th and October 20th. And it's all about integrating social scientists with more disciplinary biological and physical scientists to address pressing management questions and priorities identified in the science action agenda. So the October 14th portion of that workshop is focused on providing training to scientists who might not be familiar with social science disciplines or techniques, and to really highlight how those methods could advance the type of questions that we can address. And so there will be some case studies highlighted as a part of that training to identify how socio-ecological challenges have been researched and addressed elsewhere. The second part of the workshop on October 20th will be an interactive workshop in which social and natural scientists will be paired to co-develop mock proposals for interdisciplinary research projects in support of the science action agenda. The hope is that these mock proposals could actually lead to real proposals that could be submitted to our PSN process or to other funding calls. Both of these events are free and will be held online with an optional in-person networking event hosted in Sacramento in late afternoon on October 20th. And the breakout session for the October 20th workshop will also have an in-person component. Registration links and additional event details are now available on the Council's Social Science Community of Practice webpage, and there is also a listserv announcement that has gone out recently. With respect to our workshops, somewhat more horizontal is work on the Delta Salinity Management Workshop Series to prepare for the second workshop, which will be held in the spring of 2023. Just as a reminder, that workshop series aims to develop a collaborative scenario-based approach to salinity management planning in the face of extended drought and sea level rise. As I've discussed previously, a pilot project that will examine a limited set of scenarios and pave the way for highly focused discussions on what the knowledge gaps and modeling needs for a more comprehensive trade-off assessment are is under development. And specifically, modelers at DWR and the consulting agency RMA have developed a proposal in coordination with the workshop planning team to define the scope and methods for the pilot project modeling effort. That proposal is now undergoing external review facilitated by the Delta Science Program, and it has been presented in several focused working group meetings convened by the Delta Science Program and also by the Delta Adapts team. We've been able to leverage their stakeholder engagement process. Most recently, on August 30th, the modeling team met with a technical focused working group of participants from Delta water agencies and irrigation districts to seek technical feedback on the proposed demonstration exercise. A second, more general focus group meeting will be advertised for later this fall. Feedback that we receive in these focus group meetings will be incorporated into revisions of the proposed modeling work and/or the written report that will emerge from the workshop series that discusses the needed next steps. And then finally, the workshop, the salinity management workshop planning team convened a separate social science team composed of a diverse group of stakeholders to evaluate the human dimensions of salinity management. That group met for the first time in mid-August and will convene again later today. It will contribute to ongoing efforts to develop new models and tools to assess future salinity scenarios that are likely to impact the Delta, and also explore potential management solutions. And on a related note, with this month, I'm going to start a general practice of briefing you all on funding awards that the Delta Science Program is seriously considering, such as the award in support of the salinity management demonstration exercise that happen outside of our competitive PSN cycle. We refer to these awards as directed actions. Directed actions are a key funding mechanism that allows the science program to respond to rapidly developing events or emerging needs in the Delta, and a portion of our budget is set aside for this mechanism. Like competitive awards, directed actions go through a rigorous external review process with 3 reviewers, and only positively reviewed proposals can proceed with contracts. Our policy is that all directed actions must be responsive to the science action agenda, and they must additionally meet one of the following criteria. 1, they might be responsive to rapidly developing or rapidly changing conditions. 2, responsive to priorities of collaborative groups or workshops. 3, advance new techniques or new technology that might still be experimental in nature, but potentially have a large payoff. And 4, help promote diversity, equity, and inclusivity in Delta science. And I'll note that we do not accept unsolicited directed actions. Presently, we are considering awarding contracts for 4 directed actions. 1 is the salinity management demonstration project with a budget of $650,000. I mentioned that the demonstration exercise will simulate how a limited subset of alternative management scenarios, including a drought barrier, wetland restoration, and potentially regulatory changes, impact salinity under future sea level rise and drought conditions. The combination of structural alterations to the Delta and sea level rise will have complex 3-dimensional effects in the way that salinity is redistributed through the Delta. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but robustly simulating those effects requires large amounts of computational time, which has historically served as a barrier in doing this sort of forward-thinking trade-off analysis. In the work that we're considering funding, the modelers would use artificial intelligence to learn from these computationally expensive 3-dimensional simulations to create a computationally efficient but physically robust shortcut to relate future salinity to Delta inflows. This new computational tool, which will be made openly available to the community, will enable a wide range of future scenarios for Delta salinity management to be robustly evaluated. It will be implemented for the set of scenarios that is currently being vetted through a series of technical working groups. And I'll note finally that that project is responsive to the Science Action Agenda Action 6B, which in summary is to evaluate impacts and trade-offs of drought management actions on ecological and human communities. The second of the 4 directed actions under consideration is a Delta social environmental science data integration project with a budget of close to $700,000. Currently, so this project is responsive to the challenge that currently social science data for the Delta resides in disparate locations. It can be difficult to find. Sometimes it's not publicly available. And often it's not inherently compatible with environmental data. And these realities have served as barriers to quantitative projects that would integrate social science with biological and physical science. This directed action would fund a team at the USGS, San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Sacramento State to locate and gather relevant social science data and create a searchable catalog that provides that data in a format compatible with other environmental data sets. The team will also hold a stakeholder workshop to orient users to the social science data catalog, solicit feedback, make improvements, and identify low-hanging fruit type projects that could be implemented with this data set. And then they actually propose to do one of those projects. And this, in that way, this directed action could build off of some of the projects that emerge as priorities from the upcoming Advancing Interdisciplinary Research workshop. The work is done in partnership with the social science community of practice, and it will help implement the social science task force report and social science integration team action plan, as well as address action 1A of the science action agenda, which is to establish publicly accessible repositories and interactive platforms in support of timely decision-making and collaborative efforts. As well as action 3B, which is to develop integrated frameworks, data visualization tools, and models of the Delta socio-ecological system. The directed action that I mentioned in response to Don Natoli's question earlier is a project with a budget of about $600,000 on evaluating the impacts of fire retardants on Chinook salmon and rainbow trout. This is a project that emerged from the Interagency Ecological Program Contaminants Project Work Team. And it's also responsive to the rapidly, or to the severe fire season that we've experienced, and is having rapidly developing knock-on effects. The project looks at PhosCheck, which is a new but widely used fire retardant with poorly understood effects on aquatic life. It evaluates the lethal and sublethal toxicity of PhosCheck, as well as other fire retardants on Chinook salmon and rainbow trout, with the intent of developing new regulatory standards for LC50. LC stands for lethal concentration, and LC50 is the concentration at which 50% of test animals die as a result of exposure. And also regulatory standards for EC50, which looks at concentrations at which half of the population experiences specific sublethal effects. This action is in support of Science Action Agenda 5A, which is to identify environmental thresholds and strategies that support species recovery, and also 5D, which is to quantify spatial and temporal hotspots of chemical contaminants and evaluate ecosystem effects.
Madam Chair, could I just ask a question?
Absolutely.
Sure. Just on this, it just occurred to me that we talk about the oxygen starvation in the watershed. And then some of these products, again, I know nothing about PhosCheck, but I know part of their, they're retardant, but they have the capacity, I guess, to either, I don't know, starve oxygen is the right word, but, it's not just blanketing the area. There's some chemical reactions there that basically subdue the fire. And I guess I'm just curious, I again, very laypersonish, but if you're trying to take oxygen out of the equation with retardants, and that gets into the water, then, what, chemical reactions you may have in the water. And I guess the other question, though, the reason I wanted to ask is, don't the manufacturers and suppliers of this have to run these tests, and for what period of time? We're having to fund this, through the public arena, which, again, with, the independence that the scientists bring to this, but before they can get these things approved for wide scale use, and certainly, for good things to try to save people's homes and, save the forest, I guess I'm curious, what do they have to go through? Is it very rigorous, or is it not? And if so, shouldn't maybe some of the folks, again, retaining the independency of the scientific investigations, why wouldn't they have to conduct these studies?
An excellent question. I will need to do some research in order to provide you with an answer to that. Just speculating here, my speculation is that those companies would have to conduct these tests for the conditions, the direct conditions in which those materials are used, which would be in the terrestrial environment. My understanding of contaminant transport study or contaminant studies in general is that oftentimes sublethal effects on wildlife are poorly understood. And my supposition is that effects in the aquatic environment at environmentally relevant concentrations are also not included in those studies.
Probably weren't taken
routinely.
into account. So they did what they had to do in order to get the approvals for the use, but it didn't necessarily take into account, growing concentrations or applications that, when you're applying over tens of thousands of acres and quantities that, I have no idea what those quantities are, but you can see the news clips where, they're dropping the stuff as fast as they can fill the planes and get them in the air. So
I'll do some research and get back to you,
Yes,
because
okay.
this is something I don't know very much about.
Again, it seems to me though, that if there's, some suspected impacts that are, as you said, the sublethal or over time, then, those that are profiting from the sale of the product and getting the inventiveness of folks to try to help us, deal with a very serious issue, the wildfires and all the impacts that come with that. It's going to be there may be some additional responsibility as we progress with this, and maybe this effort begins to show that. So there'll be even future, research done on it. But
Yeah, there's quite a strong precedent for independent science research studies ultimately informing EPA regulations and even federal laws. There's a body, an agency body established within the Chesapeake Bay system that has a strong history of writing national scale laws that regulate concentrations of chemicals and pollutants that have been problematic in that system.
Good. Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
But excellent question. I'll see what I could find out for you.
Thanks.
And then the final pending directed action that I wanted to bring to your attention is on refining strategies for applying early detection and rapid response for eradicating invasive species using a case study involving ribbonweed. And I'll explain what that means. This is a lower budget project that has a budget of about $66,000. And so this just refers to the fact that for the control of invasive species, prevention of new invasions is considered by far the best defense, but having a plan for early detection and rapid response to new invaders that make it past that first defense is a paramount secondary defense. The goal of an early detection and rapid response, or EDRR strategy as it's commonly called, is to eradicate or limit the spread of new species before they proliferate to the extent that they become essentially uncontrollable. In the Biennial Delta Invasive Species Workshop held in December 2021, the Delta Interagency Invasive Species Coordination Team identified establishment of an EDR strategy for the Delta as a priority. This project, which is being led by CSU Long Beach and the Delta Conservancy, will evaluate and test an EDRR framework using ribbonweed, a submersed aquatic weed that recently invaded the Delta, as a case study. It addresses Science Action Agenda Actions 3E, which is to conduct applied research to inform EDRR strategies, and Action 5A, which is to identify and test innovative methods for control and management of invasive aquatic vegetation. So those are the 4 pending directed actions that we're considering. And I know this has been a really long report, so I'm just going to conclude my report with an abbreviated by the numbers report. The printout that you have in your packet, I'll say, was run on Monday. And so those data do not reflect this week's storms. So consequently, all the averages that you see in your report are within a few percentage points of last month's, and just in summary, reflect continued extreme drought conditions. Exports, which I don't think I reported on in my oral comments last month, are about 36% of the 20-year average for September. So I think I'll just leave it at that and see whether there are further questions from council members before turning it over to public comment.
Any other additional questions of Dr. Larson? Nope. Seeing none. We will now take public comment. Is there any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair, there's not.
Okay. Again, Laurel and Pascal, thank you so much. A quite informative report. And again, as always, truly appreciate all of your dedicated time and efforts. Obviously, this was a robust discussion because it was a robust report. So thank you again, very, very much, and truly appreciate all the questions that come. I learned some new things today, as always. And I think I was going to call you Dr. Natoli. I'm quoting you too.
Oh, goodness gracious, not. You don't want that, I tell you. I'm Dr. many times.
Councilmember Natoli clearly highlighted some of the areas that I was very curious about as well. You know, these lethal concentrations again of this fire hydrant. So yeah, we're looking forward to hearing more on what you find on that particular topic. Again, thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. And thank you, Chairman Dueña.
Absolutely. Okay, we will now move on to the Delta Water Master update. And for that, we have the very distinguished Mr. Michael George, which we all appreciate hearing from, and who quite recently I was in a tour with, and somebody from the U.S. Bureau said, I didn't realize you were, or that we had a California Delta Water Master. And so I just appreciated hearing that question, because I equally appreciated hearing the response coming from the Water Master himself, Mr. Michael George. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. And just before I start my regular report, I want to comment that this is the third time in a week that Dr. Larson and I have gone 1-2 in reports. So last Friday, we were both on a panel about the Delta at the Orange County Water Summit. About 400 people in the audience who think of the Delta as a critical conveyance point for their water. And I think the panel, which included Dr. Larson as well as DWR Director Carla Nemeth and North Delta Water Agency General Manager Melinda Terry, really gave that audience a series of additional perspectives, including the perspective that Dr. Larson is so good at, of explaining how the science action agenda fits into a lot of the management issues that come up in the Delta, and how that science action agenda over time, and particularly with the new version, has really moved to what I would call responsive science, quickly trying to get answers that affect how we manage in the Delta, and to synthesize that information, and then importantly, communicate it in a way that people like Director Natoli and Michael George can actually understand, so that it can be used in the real world. And then creating that feedback loop between decision makers, policymakers, operators, and the scientists who provide that information. So just as the chair said, I feel like I've had a great exposure over the last week to getting that sense of how dramatically the Stewardship Council, the Science Action Agenda, and Dr. Larson have really moved the needle in terms of making science responsive and relevant to what we're doing in the Delta. So with that, if we go to the next slide, just an overview of the things that I'd like to acquaint you with or mention in terms of recent activities in the Office of Delta Water Master. First of all, of course, some discussion of the drought year that is coming to a close. We're 10 days or less away from the turn of the water year on October 1st. And therefore, secondly, to look ahead at what kind of things are on the planning horizon. What are we working on for 2023 in terms of mitigating risk of persistent drought? Then some discussion about how what's happening in the Delta might fit in to implementation of the water quality control plan, either through voluntary agreements or through regulatory requirements to implement that water quality control plan. And finally, I want to just mention that recruiting for my successor is underway, and I'll talk a little bit about timing on that. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Delta drought update, one thing I will say, again, going back to earlier discussion today, is the enhanced focus on watershed protection and how what happens in the watershed ends up impacting dramatically in the Delta, in the estuary, and as Director Natoli says, from Sierra to sea. That watershed health has been getting a good deal more attention, in part because of the fires, but also the recognition that new technologies can provide new insights and new information. And I think particularly of three that have been updating over recent times. One is the rollout of OpenET as a satellite-based mechanism for accurately and consistently and in very close to real time estimating the consumptive use of water by crops in the Delta. So as I've reported before, the alternative compliance plan in the Delta is in effect for the current water year, which, as I say, ends on September 30th. And the report of water use in the Delta for agricultural crops will be reported for the first time by using OpenET through the Delta Alternative Compliance Plan. So for the reports that are due next February 1st. Secondly, in the governor's recent water strategy for aridification of our Delta watershed, there is a proposal and funding to dramatically increase stream gauges, about 400 new stream gauges throughout the state, and refurbishment of about another 200 that are out of service or haven't been maintained. So we are very quickly going to have an integrated set of sensors, monitors, gauges throughout not only the Delta watershed, but other parts of the state in consistent data formats that can talk to each other, that can be data inputs to a whole variety of models, a real leap and step forward. And at the State Water Board, one of the things that we're focused on with respect to using the new data sources, the interoperability and so forth, is to move away from our electronic water rights information management system, which is heritage, outdated electronic management system, to an entirely new system, which is called Upward. And of course, that's an acronym for something, which I can't exactly remember, but it's a new replacement system that is aimed at capturing and integrating lots of different data, not just data from OpenET or from the gauges, but also from reports of water users, from sightings of citizen scientists, as well as findings from a lot of the science that is being directed out there. So all of that is coming, all of that is exciting, but here we are in a year where we're challenged by drought. And among the things that happened this year that I want to relate is that in 2021, we received a complaint by a variety of export contractors, those who are reliant in part on exports from the Delta, complaining that a portion of the water to which they would otherwise be entitled through the projects as project contractors was being picked off in unauthorized diversions within the legal Delta. And so the chairman of the water board referred that to the Office of Delta Water Master, and I recruited colleagues from the Division of Water Rights to conduct a joint investigation, which brought the complainants into the investigation process. And one of the things that came out of this is a great deal of, I would say, kind of three-way education from the investigators, the Office of Delta Watermaster and the Division of Water Rights. We got a lot of insight about how the contractors look at the Delta and at the risk of loss of water within the Delta. Secondly, we brought in Delta water users to help inform the discussion and to provide a finer lens on the issues, because the complainants essentially used a mass balance analysis. They said, we know this much water is being released from storage. We know this much is going out to the ocean. We know this much is being exported through the pumps, and the rest of it is disappearing in the Delta, unauthorized depletions. We are now in circulation with our report and summary of the investigation, which, number one, determined that we were unable, with the support and collaboration with the other entities, to identify an actionable unlawful diversion in the Delta. Now, why is that? We go through this whole investigation with lots of resources, took over a year, and yet the report is that we were unable to identify actionable findings of unlawful diversion. Well, part of it is that we started to refine the focus. Roughly 300,000 acres of the Delta are in the North Delta, and the North Delta has a contract with the State Water Project. And so the contractors, some of them were aware of the contract, but not really the implications of it. But the implication, as we determined through the investigation, is that whatever one might do to identify a infirmity or lack of support for a water right in the Delta, in the Northern Delta, that was made up by fallback to the State Water Project contract. And so if you are a contractor depending on water resources in Oroville or Shasta, and you were hoping to find savings in the North Delta, 300,000 to the 500,000 acres under irrigated cultivation in the Delta, don't bother looking there anymore, because the fallback position is on that same State Water Project resources. And because of the coordinated operations agreement, it has an effect on both projects. So that focused us on the remaining areas, the Central Delta and South Delta water agencies, together a little less than 300,000 acres, and portions of Eastern Contra Costa County, which are outside any of those Delta water agencies, but the eastern portion of the county, Holland Tract, Webb Tract, those areas are under cultivation. So we focused on those. But because of prior work that we've done, which I've reported here, the preponderance of water rights in that area are riparian rights. So they are rights to use which are unquantified, but are directly connected to the land in the Central and South Delta and in the eastern part of Contra Costa County. So they're unquantified, but they are very much limited to use on the riparian property. And we know from recent court action that most of those water rights are riparian. So what we ended up saying is, because the way riparians share shortage is different from the main way that we manage shortage, which is via the priority system, first in time, first in right. We really don't have a way of taking the correlative shortage, the requirement that riparians share shortage when it occurs, because remember the riparian doctrine was inherited by California from wet areas. In England or in the eastern part of the United States, they don't have seasonal ephemeral streams. They have streams that run all the time, and when there's a shortage, everybody on the stream is supposed to share it. That's how correlative shortage sharing works among riparians. Whereas among appropriators, it's by priority. And in the Delta, where we've got riparians and appropriators in close proximity, sharing the same water course, you end up in kind of a whack-a-mole game, in the sense that you go to the riparians and you say, you're supposed to cut back on a correlative basis. And they say, well, wait a minute, you don't know what the correlative cutback should be until you get those appropriators cut back to their appropriate priority. In other words, cut off the juniors before you can tell us how much we need to cut back in order to share the remaining shortage. Well, of course, you can go to the appropriators and they say, well, yeah, we want to cut back on the basis of priority, but you can't tell us whether the priority is 1908 or 1915 or 1922 until you get those riparians to reduce their demand on a correlative basis. So it's a kind of, as I say, whack-a-mole game. Now, in order to, and so that's really all I want to say about the report. It's in circulation right now for comments by the participants. It'll be published on our website, I'm hoping, by the end of next month. So it'll be a document that will live on to memorialize the findings that we had, the ways that we went about the investigation, so that in the future, as we're looking at these things, we're going to be focused more on specific areas, specific ways of dealing with it, and frankly, pointing the way in the report to better ways of dealing with the unresolved issues from this investigation.
I have a question. So in summary, it's difficult to tell whether there are any unlawful diversions because you have to slice and dice the water rights in ways that we aren't yet prepared to do. Is there hope on the horizon that calculation can occur?
Yes, definitely. There are lots of things that we're working on, including some of the technology that I referred to earlier. However, because of the complexity of the tidal delta, where we tend to think about, and our laws and our concepts are really riverine systems. They're upstream, downstream, who's in priority, who needs to be curtailed in order for water to flow to the next one. Well, in the Delta, of course, we have riverine influence from a number of sources. The largest, of course, the Sacramento River, second, but much smaller, the San Joaquin River, and then McCollum and Calaveras and Puda Creek, the other smaller riverine influences. But there are lots of them, and they are all highly variable, some managed, a couple of them unmanaged, some managed high in the system, some having management facilities lower in the system. But then you get into the Delta, and the Delta is defined under Water Code 12,200 as that area that experiences tidal influence. So you've got tides moving in and out twice a day, and the amount of tidal influence can be as much as 300,000 CFS in and out. It's not necessarily new water coming in and other water flowing out. It's largely kind of packages of the same water sloshing in, sloshing out, mixing a little bit. And that riverine influence is what's critical in maintaining X2, in preventing salinity intrusion, such as we, face significant risk last year. So all of those things are at play. It's very complicated. And in a joint presentation between the Division of Water Rights and the Office Delta Water Master on Tuesday before the state board, we went through and laid out a number of the things that the water board and others are working on to solve some of these issues. But one of the things that I pointed out, no surprise to anybody here, is that anything we would do, we'd get sued for. Litigation on everything. There's too much at stake, too much uncertainty, too many alternative arguments to be
That's
made.
a familiar feeling.
Familiar feeling, exactly. So won't come as a surprise to anybody here that my view on that is that there's going to be litigation. That litigation is going to create uncertainty for a period of time. I mean, think about the fact that a week ago, Monday, on September 12th, the 6th District Court of Appeals finally handed down the appellate decision on the curtailments that the State Water Board ordered in 2015. Well, there was a whole period of time between 2015, the whiplash effect of wet years we were facing, and then a new drought. And here, several years later, the court gets around to telling us what we did wrong, which is helpful. It's something you need. That's why we litigate these critical issues. But in the interim, we had to operate. We had to make decisions day in and day out. And some of those decisions get litigated. But as that litigation takes place, and as we hope to get clarity from the courts, we got to operate in the real world, real time. And that's why collaborative action, maybe short-term actions. What will we do next month if this or that happens? What's our target this year for end of season storage? What are the risks we're willing to share in terms of potential shortage? And that's really what I want to get into next, because in the year that is just finishing, we've had in the field, in the Delta, this Delta Dry Year Response pilot program. And one of the key things for that pilot program was to understand what practices, what tweaks to agricultural water use and management in the Delta could have an effect. Number one, on reducing consumption, but really much more important within the Delta, to create a wider buffer against salinity intrusion. Because again, last year, we really focused on the fact that we were at risk because of low river influence, not much water to be released from storage, that we faced a real risk of losing salinity control in the Delta, so that we had the barrier at West Falls River. But what happened was, with this tidal pumping, salinity started to be pushed up and back, sloshing up and back, but making progress into the main stem of the San Joaquin River. And it came close, if it had gotten it so far as getting around the horn of Webb Tract, to getting into the flow from north to south toward the pumps and bringing salinity into Frank's Tract. And if we lost freshwater control of Frank's Tract, it would have had enormous impact because the amount of fresh water it would take to flush that out was off the charts, and it was water that we didn't have. So the risk that we faced helped to motivate a whole large number of agencies: California Department of Food and Agriculture, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Water Resources, State Water Board, Office Delta Water Master, as well as the 3 Delta water agencies, as well as the Delta Conservancy, and some NGOs, as well as a number of farmers. So we created, really on the fly, and for government work, it was light speed, and got a grant program out there in which we said, farmers, tell us what actions, what tweaks to your management of your farms do you think could have the most impact in terms of conserving water? And tell us what you'd be willing to do for a grant of $900 an acre. We fixed the price. We didn't know if it was the right price. Obviously, it was going to be too high for some, too low for others, but it was a price out there. And we said to farmers, shoot at this price tag. What do you think would make the most sense to accomplish those dual objectives of conserving water and dedicating that water to a broader buffer against salinity? Because again, we face risk of drought in the Delta, not as lack of water, not as lack of physical supply, but as risk of salinity intrusion to really reduce the quality and potentially destroy the quality of that fresh water. The program received 88 proposals. The money only went as far as 34 of them, but we got actions proposed by the farmers on about 9,000 acres throughout the Delta, and we monitored the hell out of it with OpenET, as well as ground truthing with eddy covariance machinery in the field, so that we could test and inform the satellites to make that information better as we went through it. And we're about a week away from the end of the program, so it's still preliminary, but we have a treasure trove of data that we've gotten not only from the participants, but also from these monitoring mechanisms that we've used. And the program has been highly successful in terms of two-way learning between the regulators, project operators, et cetera, on the one hand, and the farmers on the other. Because guess what? The farmers really knew that they had credible hunches about what would work. They weren't able to give exact estimates, but they knew what would work. And we've been able to create the data from these other data sources. So it's been a successful program. We still haven't done all the analysis of that data. We'd never anticipated that we'd have a final report on this until maybe November and December. And yet here we are facing very similar circumstances. We're a little bit better off in terms of reservoir storage, but we're still short. We're below historical averages. We're facing this aridification, the potential for even a wet year producing less manageable water. And so in the current year, the same group came together and said, okay, let's improve this. And I'm going to talk about that in another moment about what we're doing for next year. But I also want to say that in 2021, and then again this summer, the state board used its authority to implement emergency regulations to manage the curtailment process throughout the Delta watershed. Really very significant improvements in the water unavailability methodology that the water board uses to determine how much water is available at what times. It was impressive, number one, that we were able on a weekly basis to give updates to everybody, put it on the website, put out weekly notifications, change the dates of when specific water rights were curtailed, and importantly, when they would come off of curtailment. And so, as I say, we did this weekly, typically on Tuesday, effective on Wednesday of every week. The whole watershed community of water users was attuned to it, gave us real-time feedback. We incorporated additional sources of data. And for instance, in the last Friday, seeing these storms coming, even though we'd put out the update on Tuesday, on Friday, we released some of those curtailments in light of the runoff that we expected from the storm, as well as the reduction in irrigation that we expected as a result of precipitation. So that methodology has proven to be extremely valuable. So we did that on Friday. We did it again on Monday, because then we had real data how much had fallen, what kind of runoff were we getting from it, and therefore what could we expect with the Monday and Tuesday rain that we expected to have, I guess, through yesterday. So we made enormous progress. The impact on the Delta, however, was very limited, because the way we look at it in the methodology is because of this incompatibility between how you manage shortage among riparians versus appropriators. What we really do in the methodology is treat the riparians as super senior, and therefore the riparians never get curtailed, never experience that correlative reduction in their right to use until all the appropriators have been cut off. In other words, we stack the riparians behind or on top of or underneath, depending on how you look at it, all the appropriators. So in fact, during the most recent water year, in the North Delta, there were no curtailments because of the backup contract. Although we still, one of the things we're working on, Jessica, go back to your point, is how do we account for when demand in the North Delta toggles from the underlying water rights to the water right of state water project. It's a complicated issue that we are only now getting into. This is the first time we've had this kind of issue really since that contract was entered into in 1981. And it's interesting to note the timing of that 1981 contract. It was when the Department of Water Resources was prepared to enter into that contract, expecting that the next year they would begin construction on the peripheral canal. Long story about how that didn't happen. In any case, these are the issues that now that we're kind of out of the maximum risk period of the summer irrigation season, we're looking at focusing on how we're going to manage in the next year. So let's go to the next slide.
Could I just ask one question before you leave that slide,
Sure.
Michael? So on your report, which is still being circulated, so that's not yet finalized, is it safe to say, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, but that, and you didn't, again, talking about the complexity of it, but you didn't identify, you talked about the source of the complaint, what the complaint was and how the calculus was done, but that you didn't find widespread unauthorized diversions, or that's still yet to be concluded. There may be diversions, maybe unauthorized ones. And I guess as you continue to refine that work in a collaborative way, which I appreciated your take on that. But is there any conclusion? Again, maybe I'll let you summarize. I'm just curious. So you had to investigate that. You're going to issue a report on that. And again, I don't want to get ahead of your report, but I'm just, I guess I'm curious about, because I've heard those allegations, in different sectors over the years, and I think this is probably the first time with any beyond work you've done previously to look at water rights applications and, how people were adhering to that and the reporting, been instituted through your office and working collaboratively with others. I'm curious if you had to make a conclusion around that, based upon what the complaint was, acknowledging the complexity. What were the findings?
Fair question,
Yeah.
and you're not jumping the gun at all.
Yeah.
You'll be able to read it in all its glory within the next month. But I don't think even the complainants believe that it was widespread unauthorized diversion, and some of the complexity is also legal complexity, because there is a litigable issue about the extent to which the release of project water, which has among its purposes, going back to the founding of the CVP and the State Water Project, among the purposes are to maintain a freshwater delta for beneficial use, not only for export, but for use within the watershed. So there is a litigable issue that hasn't been resolved about whether water users in the Delta are intended beneficiaries, protected beneficiaries of those releases of stored water. We didn't get into that. We list that at the end of the report as among those unresolved issues. But it was clear from the investigation that a significant amount of the water that moves through the delta and keeps it fresh in extended drought periods comes from release of project stored water. And then you get into the issue for the lawyers as to whether that's natural flow, to which riparians have a right, or whether it's unnatural flow, I should say. It's foreign in time. In addition, you've got the complication that some of that water is imported into the watershed, and a riparian shouldn't have the right to Trinity River water that is diverted from the Trinity system into the Sacramento system coming into the Delta. So big complexity, but I think we also narrowed the scope of the problem away from saying just all these depletions that we can't identify must be unlawful diversions. We also focused on how much of it is evaporation from open water, how much of it is ET of riparian vegetation, how much more riparian vegetation are we going to have as we do restoration activities, how much of the ET is from aquatic vegetation that we're trying to get rid of, but uses a lot of water. So I think in many respects, we identified a lot of the complexities and narrowed the kinds of inquiry that we need to do to decide how to manage. And frankly, however we manage, we'll get sued for it.
And who will be tasked with that work? Again, through your office, obviously you have your role and authorities, but what you just listed, then beyond or maybe before litigation, if some of those things are undertaken by whoever would be the responsible party or parties, maybe trying to be a little proactive versus reactive, will the report indicate who might want to then take the next steps and whether it's your office and successor or somebody else? So I think that's important because litigation will come whenever folks feel compelled to do that because of their interest in the matter. But we can get out ahead of it because, again, just as you talked about the evapotranspiration for native vegetation and or through crops and crop changes that are occurring, and whether you benefit and or see additional components that add to the loss. I guess I'm just curious, Michael. So who will be responsible? Will your report kind of indicate? I say who's responsible, but suggested actions going forward to maybe get ahead of litigation and build off the good work. Again, I appreciate the way you've certainly explained it, but also you give me some appreciation for what it's taken thus far just to get to this. Try to answer at least a portion of what the question was and the complaint that came to you.
Exactly. So yes, we do describe steps that need to be taken. So yeah, we tried to narrow the issues, focus the issues, and as you can appreciate, some issues are the responsibility of some parties and others, other parties. And one of the things that I think is hopeful is that many of those parties, if they see the problem the same way, can find ways of collaborating. And yes, there will be issues on which there will be disagreement that will ultimately go to the courts, but there will be a lot of areas in which there can be agreement and where collaboration is the most likely outcome. So who's involved? Certainly the Office of Delta Water Master and the Division of Water Rights within the Water Board. Then the two projects very much involved and focused on this. The collaboration in the science action agenda is getting at a number of these issues. So yes, I think we will have increased collaboration as a result of the collaboration that we got into the investigation. I think we understand the issues better, and the issues are understood better, and the different perspectives are understood better by water users in the Delta, by export contractors, by the project operators, and certainly by the regulators.
I would say I find that very encouraging, Michael. I do. I think that, from my involvement over the years to hear what you've just outlined and certainly informed by the science, and all that work. But again, it won't make for easy solutions or not necessarily avoid litigation, but I find that encouraging in terms of the work of this council and its, capable staff. That is encouraging. Thanks.
Okay.
Michael, just wanted to, number one, thank you. This has been incredible. Just wanted to let you know, we've got about 10 more minutes before we have to wrap up. We have a workshop that we've got to start at 1 o'clock. And I know my peers are not going to be happy with me if I don't give them time to eat.
So no worries. I've only got 100 more slides. I'll go through them quickly. And seriously, I take your point and I will be complete within 10 minutes.
Perfect.
In fact, much of what I want to say about the 2023 year is that we're taking the preliminary data and understanding that we've gotten from the dry year response program, and the governor's budget funded it for the 2023 year because we face many of the same risks. So we're going forward with it based on the model that we created on the fly this year. It'll be a grant program managed by the Delta Conservancy, funded by a $10 million budget through the Department of Water Resources. We're tweaking it to make it better, still focusing on farmers telling us what they're prepared to do, but we're using a reverse auction this year. So instead of setting a price and saying, what can you do under that price? We're saying, we've learned these things work in different areas. Propose an action that you'll do to tweak your farming operations on your area. Tell us the adjacent field or the nearby field that we should use as a control. Where is their business as usual with similar soil characteristics, similar crops, similar water elevations, et cetera, so that we can compare, hopefully, apples to apples to get more data about what works. And instead of us saying $900 an acre, we're saying, you tell us what you can do, bid for it, and similar actions we'll put in a basket, and we'll determine what we're calling a market clearing price. How much of that action can we afford? Where do we want to put it throughout the physical delta? How many different actions do we want to fund? And for each basket of actions, we'll set the highest price we need to pay in order to fill that bucket within the constraint, obviously, of the budget. And then everybody who bid and who gets selected will get paid that market clearing price. It sounds complicated. I think farmers are getting it. We're doing a lot of outreach, and I'm hoping that we're going to get more actions, maybe smaller actions, which are tweaks on existing farming practices. For instance, if you're going to flood up for a duck club, maybe you can extend the period of time that you're flooded up. Maybe you start earlier or you finish later. That has positive impacts for migrating birds, and it shifts the water demand to a winter period instead of the summer period where you've got the higher risk of salinity intrusion. So the water in the Delta is available. It will particularly be available in the wintertime. Although one of the requirements for this, for proposing a project, is that on a full water year basis, there've got to be the expectation of net savings that are confirmed by our Open ET investigation of what we learned from this year. So it's got to be a net savings overall, and yet it could also have the effect of increasing water use in certain periods of the year in order to capture savings at a more critical time. And all of this, Judge Amrau, will be determined based on Open ET. I'll go to the next slide now. It's important to think about these actions and what we're learning and how water managers are changing their practices in the Delta in terms of how the Delta might fit into either proposed voluntary agreements or regulatory approaches to implementing water quality control planning. So again, with the caveat or the reminder that the Delta experiences drought not as a lack of water, but as risk of water quality. And the maximum threat to water quality is in June, July, August, September, the heavy irrigation months when riverine throughput through the Delta is constrained. And yet, when we're trying to ameliorate threats to migrating fish, that tends to happen in the wintertime, so it's kind of off cycle. And therefore, we're looking now with a lot of partners about what kinds of trade-offs make the most sense, because we really are focused on trade-offs. It's not like you can have everything you want. If you devote water or resources to one use, it has an effect on other competing uses. And so we're trying to figure out what we do in the Delta and what can be predictably done either in a persistence of the current drought or when this next occurs. So that's one of the areas that we're focused on in terms of looking forward. We want predictable responses, but in those predictable responses, we want to take into account inherent uncertainty in the system, which is changing rapidly, the uncertainty as we start any water year about what the hydrology will bring us, and how this should fit in to an overall watershed-wide water quality control planning effort. So that's some of the stuff that we're working out on a collaborative basis. And now to the next slide, and this is either last or next to last. The recruiting is underway for my successor. As you know, I will complete my second 4-year term on January 6th. I say that, and I hesitate to say, or I jump to say, and it's only coincidental that's the second anniversary of the insurrection. The selection here is by the Water Board in consultation with the council. The notice of vacancy may be out as early as today or tomorrow, but pretty soon, and it will be open for applications through the end of October. There'll be a review period by the Water Board and proposed decision before the end of the year, so that my successor, I finished on Friday. We hope my successor, he or she, will be on the job the following Monday, because there is no provision for a statutory position such as this for any overlap. It's kind of weird. And I've said from the beginning, I'm done at the end of my second term. I don't want to be second guessing a successor. I'm around to the extent the successor cares what I think, but I'm not going to be hovering to make sure my pet projects get the same focus that I've had. In any case, that's coming. I hope to have at least one more report to this board, and maybe at that one, I'll be able to introduce my successor. I hope that's the case. And I think that's under the final 10 minutes I had, Chairman Dueño, and I'm finished. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them.
Are there any questions of our water master, our distinguished water master, Michael George, from the council? And I'm going to ask if you could speak up, because I couldn't hear Judge Damrell just a couple minutes ago. So if you have a questions, please let me know, because I couldn't hear him.
Chair, I've got a question. This is Jessica.
Absolutely.
The recent decision on curtailments, how does that impact the work on the diversions, or does it?
My reading of it is that it has virtually no effect. And this is one of the problems with having so long it takes. The court gave us direction that the section of the water code under which we proceeded in 2015 didn't provide the authority that the board thought it had under that section. But it is interesting that the court itself said the water board might have successfully done exactly the same thing if it had proceeded under different parts of its authority. And importantly, the court pointed to emergency regulation authority. Well, in 2021 and 2022, the board has proceeded with emergency regulatory authority, which the court seems to have said would have been a way of getting at largely the same thing. It's a much more efficient way of getting at it. In 2015, we were trying to go after specific diverters and kind of enforce as an example to impact the delta. Whereas emergency regulations allow for the use of this dramatically improved supply demand availability methodology to make decisions, which the water board, the Division of Water Rights generally throughout the state, and with the concurrence of the Delta Water Master within the legal delta, impacts whole classes. Anybody who's got a water right at, such and such a date, it's curtailed. If you're later than that, it's not curtailed. If you're earlier than that. I want to say that the direction from the court is valuable, but it seems to validate the direction the board has moved in anyway. The court also indicated that the water board might have proceeded differently if its objective had been articulated as protecting stored water releases instead of going under a provision of the water code, which said that the unlawful diversion of water is a trespass against the state, actionable in an enforcement proceeding. And the limitation that the court pointed out was that authority went back to 1914, but it did not confer on the water board the authority as among pre-14 water rights holders to say, you at 1912 need to be curtailed because you've got a senior at 1908. The court basically said that under that particular part of the statute, there was no authority to go to pre-14s. They were grandfathered in, and therefore the water board has the authority to decide whether it's a valid or an invalid right and whether it's being exercised within its limits, but cannot exercise authority as it attempted to do in 2015 as between pre-14 water rights holders. So it's important information, but it doesn't affect where the water board is proceeding right now. Judge Damerel, you probably want to turn on your microphone.
Thank you. My concern is that the state proposes, but there's no. I mean, you have a court cases that are proceeding, and you don't know what the judge is going to do, and so it seems to me that there ought to be some attempt to measure the effect of potential judicial action versus the board action or your action, for example. And I don't see the connection there. I mean, it seems to be they're both flying different places and different heights. So how do you marry your decisions and the board's decision versus in our decision versus with the reality that is going on, beneath us? I mean, do you understand my question? I mean, that's
absolutely, and it is the conundrum that we're facing every day. It takes a long time for the courts to decide whether what we did was precisely correct and whether the basis on which we proceeded was precisely correct or not. In the meantime, we're trying to manage in real time with enormous numbers of variables and dynamics that are changing in a time before we can get the court's decision. So we're doing that, and we are, in doing that, taking risk. We've been sued on the 2021 regulations, and we've been sued again on the 2022 regulations. Nonetheless, we have implemented them. And in the fullness of time, the courts will decide whether what we did was appropriate, inappropriate, immoral, illegal, or fattening.
Well, it just seems totally inappropriate. That marry the two ideas which are salient past each other. I mean, we can't help that. Well,
I would say, Judge Amaral, that I'm personally gratified that what the court said is the direction we've taken since 2015 appears to be the direction that the court in dicta, because it wasn't that issue, but said that looks more promising.
Any other questions? Michael, I just want to, again, let you know how much I appreciate your wealth of knowledge and expertise. I don't know if you can tell, but I have just a ton of notes, and I have a lot of questions that are going to take way, way too long for me to ask during the session. So if I could have a redress with you, and maybe I could follow up with you next week. We did have a discussion about maybe meeting at some point. And so maybe that would be my request of you, if we could have a meeting at some point. And some of these questions are probably really basic, but they're questions that I want to ask anyway. So absolutely.
And I'm pleased to have that opportunity. We really haven't had a lot of that since COVID set in, but I agree. I think face-to-face communications, the opportunity for questions and so forth, really valuable. So I would love to have that session with you, and maybe multiple sessions as well. We do have a standing senior staff meetings between the Water Board and the council, and we have in the past had pre-COVID both senior staff and the two chairs at the Water Board and at the Stewardship Council. I think there's widespread desire to reconvene those regular sessions.
That would be great. Again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I really would like to boycott your leaving, but I don't think that I have that option. Beck, is there any public comment?
No, Madam Chair, there is not.
Okay, seeing none, we will now recess for lunch, and we will reconvene at 1 p.m. for the Appeals Procedures Workshop. Thank you all. Okay, I will wait for somebody to give me a cue that we are ready to go. Okay, it is now 1:01, and we are coming back from our lunch break. We are now going to resume with our workshop to the draft amendments to administrative procedures governing appeals. This is an information item, and at this time I will introduce Jessica Pearson, our executive officer. And Jessica, before you start, just want to let the public know that this item is going to be up for public comment, and each public commenter will have 5 minutes to speak. And again, I'd like to introduce Jessica Pearson, who will introduce our panel. Jessica.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we are here on agenda item 12. It's a workshop for the draft amendments to the administrative procedures governing appeals for the council. This is an information item. When the council was first formed in 2010, it adopted its administrative procedures governing appeals, or for short, the appeals procedures for covered actions. This was done notably years before the Delta Plan itself was developed and before the first certifications of consistency were ultimately filed. So now, after going through the appeals process multiple times in the recent years, and as we've identified in our 5-year review of the Delta Plan, council staff is recommending amendments to these procedures to provide clarity and efficiency to the process. The initial proposed amendments were released for public comment late last year, and staff will summarize the comments that we received in today's presentation. Today's workshop really provides an opportunity to hear from council members and the public on proposed changes and comments received before further revising the appeals procedures and bringing them back for council consideration at a future meeting. I will now pass it over to Jeff Henderson, our Deputy Executive Officer for Planning and Performance, to highlight the proposed amendments. And with him, we have Eva Bush, our Program Manager in Planning. Welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, council members. It's a pleasure to be here to present on the draft amendments to the administrative procedures governing appeals, or as Jessica mentioned, we will shorthand this as our appeals procedures. And want to just extend thanks to the staff who have been contributing to this work, notably Eva Bush, who's here to my left, as well as former staff member Avery Livingood, who provided work on this project for a couple of years prior to her departure from the council. So I believe I get to do my own slides. Wow. All right, we're going to start with a little bit of background on covered actions and appeals. And so these are our administrative procedures that address appeals to certifications of consistency for covered actions under the Delta Reform Act. So it's kind of that chart over on the right, but working up from the bottom. Coming back down, a covered action is a project that meets certain criteria established in the Reform Act that a certifying agency, if they're proposing to build, to fund, or to approve a project in the Delta that meets these criteria, they need to certify that that action is consistent with the Delta Plan. And that is done following some early consultation work which is a period where the council staff and the agency staff work together to understand the requirements for submittal of that covered action certification and the alignment of the project with the various different Delta Plan regulations. We have a checklist that's available on the council's website to assist local agencies with that process. And we again facilitate that early consultation process that I mentioned. The agency then certifies that their project submits a certification of consistency for their project to the council, and that's a consistency with the Delta Plan, specifically the 14 regulations established in the Delta Plan as they relate to that particular project. They submit these to the council using our online covered actions portal. And importantly, that certification requires detailed findings regarding the consistency of that project with the Delta Plan. The Reform Act provides a mechanism for appeals of covered action certifications of consistency. And under the Reform Act, any person may file an appeal of a certification of consistency, but that appeal needs to be filed no later than 30 days after the submission of the original certification of consistency. And just for clarification, the actual wording of any person is any person who claims that a proposed covered action is inconsistent with the Delta Plan. And as a result of that inconsistency, that action would have a significant adverse impact on achievement of one or both of the co-equal goals or implementation of government-sponsored flood control programs to reduce risks to people and property in the Delta. So it is a very wide-ranging standing that is afforded to folks to appeal projects that could occur within the Delta, and it is specified in the Reform Act. And then the council will hear appeals and make findings regarding those appeals, and those findings can either be to deny the appeal or to remand the matter back to the certifying agency for consideration. And the council's appeals process is conducted under the substantial evidence standard of review that we'll be touching upon a bit later in the presentation. So by way of background for these appeals procedures amendments, on December 10th of 2021, the council released proposed draft amendments for a 90-day public review period, which concluded on March the 7th of 2022. During that period, we received 7 comment letters that identified a range of issues and concerns. Those letters were received from the Department of Water Resources, the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Agency, the Solano County Water Agency, state water contractors, Valley Water, Siluri Meserve, and the Delta Protection Commission. And at today's workshop, we're going to summarize the draft, both the draft amendments that were proposed in December of 2021 and a summary of the comments received for further public comment and council discussion. So today we'll review the changes that we circulated last December, the topics of the various different comments that we've received, and you'll have another opportunity to hear from commenters regarding their interests and concerns with the proposed revisions that were circulated last December, as well as the summary of issues received. And we would look to the commenters to further clarify their considerations. At the conclusion of our workshop, we do have a recommendation for the council, and that's to direct us as staff to prepare and circulate a revised version of the draft amendments for potential adoption at a future meeting, or to bring the item back for further discussion and additional workshop prior to doing so. So we can touch upon that as we get toward the conclusion of today's workshop. So what are the administrative procedures governing the appeals? Essentially, they're the rules of the road for our council's appeals process. There are currently 31 such rules that are specified in a document that the council adopted in 2010, following a process fairly similar to the one that we're engaged in now. And as Jessica mentioned in the introduction, those original guidelines were adopted prior to the Delta Plan, prior to the regulations, prior to the rulemaking process for the regulations in the Delta Plan, prior to any covered actions being filed, let alone any appeals. So a lot has happened since these original procedures were adopted in 2010, and we are looking to learn from the experiences of each of those things: adopting the Delta Plan, promulgating regulations, processing covered actions, and considering appeals. Importantly, the Reform Act exempts the appeals procedures from the normal rulemaking process that's associated with the Administrative Procedure Act. Essentially, that means that the council is the sole approving body of these appeals procedures. They do have regulatory force and effect, but they are not subject to the normal rulemaking process. As such, we've designed a public process to provide an opportunity for public input, as we've seen through the comments received on the draft, and as exemplified by the workshop today. But the final approval for the appeals procedures lies with the council. And conducting the proceedings for the various appeals that we've received over the last several years have highlighted a number of areas where our procedures could be revised to help that process move more predictably, more smoothly, and more efficiently. And we've proposed those types of revisions in the draft that was circulated in December. And as Jessica mentioned, we did identify the need for these types of amendments as part of the 2019 5-year review. So we'll quickly summarize the types of amendments that were incorporated in the December draft. We did make a number of changes to language to better mirror the Delta Reform Act. revised wording considering the council's authority to better mirror the Reform Act. We specified filing deadlines and tried to clarify those deadlines for the filing of certifications and appeals. These are things like whether it's calendar days or working days, what the final deadline is for submitting an appeal or a certification, for example. We established, we worked to clarify standards related to timeliness and completeness of appeals, and to clarify the standards for what it means for an appeal to be received timely and considered complete. We clarified our requirements for evidentiary requests, the process whereby parties want to add materials to the record that is submitted by the certifying agency at the start of the process. We included provisions that would clarify the process for notices and using notices for example, notices for public hearing to establish additional deadlines, to identify schedules, and set a time frame and timeline for the appeals, as well as the procedures to be used in a hearing. Regarding party submittals, the December draft amendments sought to clarify and refine standards for various different written submittals that the council requests from the parties, and to clarify the process that gives and to give the council the ability to establish deadlines, schedules, and timelines. The existing procedures are somewhat ambiguous with regard to the ability to establish an enforceable deadline, for example. And so that's something that we sought to achieve in these amendments. We sought to clarify the review of and decisions on appeals, and to clarify the proceedings related to substantive review and decision of the council, in the sense of really clarifying the substantial evidence standard of review and the expectation, for example, that the burden of proof of a lack of substantial evidence to support a certification lies with the appellant. And this also included stipulations that would provide an avenue for extension of timelines upon agreement by all parties, and the process for processing dismissals, remands, and denials of appeals. We also sought to address the new state accessibility requirements associated with documents posted on websites, and through that process to encourage that electronic submittals to the council by the various parties to a certification and appeal would need to meet federal and state document accessibility standards. And we're setting that forward as an encouragement, recognizing that not all of the agencies that would participate in the process are subject to all of those exact guidelines. So we'll now move to the types of issues and concerns that we heard in the various comments that have been identified from those 7 parties that I mentioned earlier. And I do anticipate these are topics that you'll hear from commenters about today. But so I'll provide just a brief roadmap to those, and then we'll move to the public comment period. So first, one of the first key issues that we received comments on was the role of the Delta Protection Commission in the council's appeals process. And just for context, the existing appeals procedures, as well as the proposed revisions, provide that the commission may testify before the council concerning an appeal or regarding an appeal. And we received comments that state that the appeals procedures as proposed fail to acknowledge the commission's broad authority to comment on matters before the council, including appeals, with reference to a portion of the Public Resources Code that addresses the commission's ability to make recommendations and comments to the council. So we do anticipate we'll hear a bit more about those issues today, as well as the others. The next key topic that we heard a variety of comments about concerns the burden of proof under an appeal and the standard of review that the council uses to address appeals. And the draft amendments that were circulated reiterate the practice that the council's standard of review is the substantial evidence standard, and that that's specified in Water Code section 85225.25. Furthermore, the draft amendments that we circulated clarify that the burden of proof to show that a certification of consistency is not supported by substantial evidence in the record lies with the appellant. That's a statement that appears in virtually all of our determinations regarding appeals that reflects the fact that a certification of consistency under the substantial evidence standard is presumed valid unless it's demonstrated that there is not substantial evidence in the record to support it. And the burden for that demonstration does lie appropriately with an appellant. And then commenters also state that the draft amendments in various different ways misstate the standard of review and inappropriately place that burden on appellants. So in essence, we believe we're appropriately placing that burden where it lies, and we've got multiple comments identifying a potential dispute of that point. Next slide. That's to myself. Okay, we're now addressing certifications, early consultation, and appeals for remanded issues. This is another category of comments that we received. For context, the current appeals procedures don't address what the scope of an appeal for a revised certification that's submitted to the council following a remand would be. This became apparent in the Lookout Slough proceedings in the sense that we had received a certification of consistency, had considered appeals, made a ruling on those appeals, remanding certain matters back to the certifying agency. Certifying agency then resubmits a certification of consistency, and there was a bit of a lack of clarity in the existing procedures as to what happens when that occurs. I think it wasn't something that was foreseen as eminently in the original procedures as we needed to put into practice. So one of the things that we're considering is speaking specifically to the scope of such an appeal in the appeals procedures, and to clarify that those appeals would be limited to, one, issues identified in the council's findings to remand, or two, due to material changes to the project. And those are essentially the two items that we considered in the context of the Lookout Slough proceeding. So, for example, if a party appeals an issue in the original certification and the council rules upon that issue and does not remand that issue back, that issue is closed for future appeals. So, and just to really clarify that point, we're seeking to make revisions to the appeals procedures for that purpose. We also heard some concerns regarding early consultation following a remand. And again, early consultation is a process that we use as a staff with certifying agencies to identify, one, to help an agency identify if their project is a covered action. And if it is, to identify the materials necessary to provide as part of a certification of consistency, and to assist those agencies in that process. And it's important, I think, to note that the stated intent of early consultation, as it's spelled out in the Water Code in 85225.5, is to assist state and local public agencies in preparing the required certification, and that early consultation occurs between those agencies and the council. And our current practice is to rely on the certifying agency to help determine the parties that would participate in the early consultation process. We did receive a number of comments requesting that the council create a role for the public and for previous appellants in that early consultation process following a remand. So I do suspect that that's also an issue that we'll hear more from our commenters about today. The next topic is public notice for draft certifications of consistency. Our current procedures include a 10-day posting requirement that is a requirement on agencies that are not otherwise subject to the Brown Act or Bagley-Keene Act public meeting requirements. So in essence, agencies that are not headed by a board or commission or council type of a setup. And that those types of agencies need to make drafts of their certification of consistency available for public review and comment at least 10 days prior to submitting a certification of consistency to the council. So again, the purpose of that 10-day review is to provide an opportunity for public review and comment concerning the certification that the agency intends to submit. Our current procedures further advise that those agencies provide notice of the posting to all persons requesting that notice. We did receive a number of comments on the draft submitted, or the draft that was circulated in December, requesting that that timeline, for example, be extended to 30 days or to 45 days, and to identify specific entities that should be provided notice of that posting. So again, another topic that we may hear additional expansion on. We also got a number of comments regarding some amendments that we proposed considering the contents of an appeal. And the draft amendments that we circulated in December identify a host of different types of content that must be included in an appeal, including the requirement to identify the Delta Plan policy that's being appealed by the appellant and the specific provisions of that policy that are the subject of the appeal. I will say that the draft we circulated in December included a variety of revisions where our objective was to clarify what the expectation is with regard to what's being submitted by the party that's lodging an appeal. And the commenters that we heard from on this state that a variety of the different things that we proposed had the potential to create confusion and should be simplified. Commenters also stated that adding additional specific detailed requirements unduly would raise the bar for appeals beyond what the water code required or intended. And so this is a comment that we very much take to heart and would like to hear more perspective regarding, as well as intend to address in future revisions if so directed by the council. And as I'd mentioned, some of our changes that we circulated last December concerned evidentiary requests. There are two rules in the appeals procedures, Rule 10 and Rule 29. These specify the various different parameters under which parties can supplement the record that was submitted by the certifying agency as part of the appeals process, including requests for official notice. And you'll recall from our appeals process that the record plays an extremely important role in that process, in the sense that the certification of consistency, the test is that whether the certification of consistency is supported by substantial evidence that is in the record that was before the agency at the time of certification. And so there are processes under our appeals procedures that outline acceptable means for amending that record, and those amendments would be performed either by the council or by the individual parties that are a party to that appeal, whereas the original record is submitted by the certifying agency. And we included a number of draft amendments, again, with the intent of clarifying the content required for any request to supplement the record. These were things like requesting a cover page be placed on these items, identifying what the record is and the purpose for which it was being sought to be added to the record. We got a number of comments on these suggesting that for records to be considered before the agency, which is one of the requirements of Rule 10, that appellants should provide support that those records were submitted to or considered by that agency and not merely in existence at the time of certification. So we interpret this comment to be a desire to better connect the documents being requested to be submitted as part of the record to the actual decision made by the agency, as opposed to merely something that may have been, for example, published by the agency, but perhaps unrelated to the matter. So that's a topic, again, I think we may hear a bit more about. We also got comments requesting that the certifying agency be given an opportunity to respond to any such requests for record augmentation before the council decides to grant a request. And for context, we currently provide that procedure by including those record augmentation requests as part of the draft determination that's presented to the council for final action at the conclusion of the appeals hearings process. We got some comments concerning hearing presentations and public comments. We included a number of proposed revisions that provide that the various parties to the appeal and the Delta Protection Commission may make presentations and that all other persons may make written comments, as well as that the order and the timing of presentations for a hearing would be specified in that hearing's notice. I will confess that in the revisions to these particular procedures, we proposed language that could be interpreted, unfortunately, to limit public comment. And I want to acknowledge that was absolutely not our intent and is something that we seek to correct in the revised guidelines. We did hear from commenters that the proposed changes would preclude those other than parties and the commission from making oral presentations during the hearing. We also heard that oral presentations being made by non-parties could be considered appropriate in very limited circumstances. And we also heard that the appeals procedures clarify, a request that the appeals procedures clarify that the certifying agency be given presentation time at a hearing that's equal to the combined presentation time that's afforded to all appellants and the commission. This is an example of something that we have essentially done in practice and have specified in a hearing notice, and we interpret the nature of the comment to be a request to elevate that process up to the appeals procedures such that it becomes more uniform and it is more predictable at the outset of a process. Again, concerning the record that we mentioned earlier, we got a number of comments concerning the timeline associated with submitting that record to the council. And the appeals procedures currently, so before the revisions in December, required that the record supporting a certification of consistency be submitted within 10 days following the effective date of an appeal. So an agency certifies their project, 30 days goes by potentially to appeal that project. An appeal is received, and then 10 days following that appeal, that record is due from the certifying agency. The proposed revisions that we circulated back in December would shorten that time period to 5 days and would state that the certifying agency is strongly encouraged, but not required to submit the record with the certification. So two things in play there. One would be moving from 10 days back to 5 days after the appeal for the deadline for the record, as well as a strong encouragement to actually submit that record along with the certification. Shortening the time frame from the 10 to 5 days, from staff's perspective, shortening the time frame from 10 to 5 days has two benefits. It affords staff additional time with the record in the preparation of our preparations for the hearing and ultimately the determination made by the council. Importantly, it also provides appellants additional time with the record, which is important when we consider the appellant's burden relative to the record. The appellant has to show that the action wasn't supported by evidence in the record. The appellant doesn't have that record until at least under our proposal 5 days after the certification, 5 days after the appeal, currently 10 days. Some commenters in turn requested that the current 10-day requirement should be maintained because of the level of effort necessary to gather those records and submit them. And still other commenters requested that the council require that that record be submitted at the time of certification. Again, from a staff perspective with regard to that, I think it's important to remain cognizant of the fact that most certifications are not appealed, and the record becomes an important consideration in the context of an appeal. So we want to be mindful of the burden placed on agencies that are certifying projects that are not anticipating appeal and not necessarily imposing that record requirement on them at that time. That concludes our tour through the December revisions, as well as the comment themes and the topics that we received comments about. With regard to next steps, we intend to conduct this workshop today, hear council member questions and comments, have public comment and some discussion, and then we'll be looking to the council to either provide us direction to go forward and make further revisions to the amendments based on the comments received and the discussion today, and bring that back to the council for consideration after circulating it publicly, to bring that back to a future meeting where the council might take action on that recommendation. Alternatively, if the council sees fit, we could conduct an additional workshop, an additional listening session to gather additional input. But in terms of a staff recommendation, we feel that we're in a relatively good place with regard to consideration of the comments received and are prepared to take the next steps to produce a revised draft, circulate that publicly, and bring it back to the council for further review. And that concludes the staff presentation, Madam Chair. Happy to entertain any questions from members.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Eva. Great presentation. I'd like to bring it back to the council for questions, comments, discussion, and then we'll open it up for public comment.
Madam Chair, I'm going to hold my comments until we hear from the speakers. I know we've communicated through the commission, and again, have been briefed appropriately by Jeff and Jessica on a couple of occasions. So I want to hear from some of our speakers, and I'll have some questions at that point. Thanks. Very good, Councilmember Natoli. I'm looking to the dais to see if there's any questions. And I'm going to ask Councilmember Zingali, I know you're on the phone. If you have any questions before we go on to the public comment period.
Not at this point. I may after we hear the comments and after we hear from Mr. Natoli, but I appreciate the thoroughness of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Zingali. Okay, seeing no questions from the council, we'll now open it up for public comment. Beck, do we have public comment?
Yes, Madam Chair. Travis, can you make me a co-host? We have Brenda Bass, who I'll be switching over shortly.
Great. And again, I just want to remind those that will be commenting, number one, welcome and thank you for participating. We do truly, absolutely value public comment, and you will be given up to 5 minutes to provide your public comment on this workshop. And we are ready when you are.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, Council. My name is Brenda Bass with the California Chamber of Commerce. Cal Chamber is the largest broad-based business advocate to government in California, and our membership represents 1/4 of the private sector jobs in California and includes companies of all sizes and from every industry within the state. And I am here today to support the comments that were made by the state water contractors and Valley Water. I know they will have speakers later. I guess I jumped the line for them, but also the written comments that they submitted earlier this year. From our perspective, it is of utmost importance that agencies act within the scope of authority delegated to them by the California legislature. This ensures more predictable regulatory outcomes and helps avoid judicial invalidation of regulatory action. Together, this means that projects can move forward more quickly through any administrative approvals that are needed. The meaning of substantial evidence review is well settled in California law as a deferential standard and one that is based on a review of evidence in the record before a lower body. We echo the concerns raised by the state water contractors and Valley Water that the proposed amendments might invite the consideration of extra record evidence and invite an overall reevaluation and reweighing of evidence on appeal. And we believe this would be inconsistent with the statutory direction that the council review a consistency determination only on a substantial evidence basis. So for these reasons, we urge the council to take a hard look at the proposed amendments and ensure that the appeal procedures do not exceed the plain language of the authority granted by the legislature. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide these comments today.
Thank you, Brenda. Appreciate your comments. Next speaker, Beck.
Next, we have Rebecca Harms. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Rebecca, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, council and council staff. My name is Rebecca Harms. I am the Deputy General Counsel for the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority. The Water Authority appreciates the opportunity to participate today in this workshop and provide comment. We submitted written comments on the draft amendments in March 2022. And the Water Authority thanks staff for touching on the points made in its written comments in the staff report and in today's presentation. However, while the staff report and today's presentation summarizes, at least to some degree, the Water Authority's comments, they do not provide much indication on how the comments will be integrated into the draft amendments. For this reason, the Water Authority supports staff's recommendation with respect to next steps for the draft amendments. As mentioned, staff recommends that it be allowed to revise the current draft of the amendments in consideration of public and council comments and distribute a revised version for public review prior to bringing them back to the council for consideration. The Water Authority believes this is a sensible course of action that will yield further improvements to the draft amendments. Lastly, I would like to just briefly emphasize here the specific comments that the Water Authority has on the draft amendments. First, the appeals procedure needs to be amended to limit successive appeals of revised certifications of consistency. Successive appeals that raise new issues that could have been raised previously or that repeat issues already addressed by the council on a prior appeal would not be productive. Based on today's presentation, it seems staff is on the right track with respect to addressing this issue based on lessons learned from Lookout Slough, and we look forward to seeing those revisions. Second, with respect to evidentiary requests, the certifying agency should be given an opportunity to respond to any requests for augmentation of the record or for official notice of additional information. Today's staff presentation suggested that this opportunity is already provided with respect to requests for augmentation of the record, but we think an opportunity to respond should be provided for requests for official notice as well. Regardless, it seems some clarifying revisions with respect to this issue would be beneficial. Third, oral presentation by non-parties during a hearing may be appropriate and should be allowed in limited circumstances. For example, upon a showing of good cause and a determination by the council that the presentation would not include irrelevant evidence. And lastly, the council should preserve the provision in the existing appeal procedure that allows an agency 10 days to submit the administrative record. 5 calendar days is simply too short of a time given potential staff shortages, weekends, and holidays. Further detail on these comments is included in the Water Authority's March 2022 comment letter. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to comment today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Beck, next speaker.
Next, we have Robert Horton. Robert, you should be able to unmute yourself. Robert, are you with us?
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Robert.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My name is Robert Horton. I'm an attorney with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, but I'm here today commenting on behalf of the state water contractors, of which Metropolitan is a member. And the state water contractors represents 27 public water agencies up and down the state that participate in the state water project and collectively provide a portion of water supply delivered to 27 million Californians, which is roughly 2/3 of the state's population and over 750,000 acres of irrigated agriculture. The contractor supports Delta science. They support habitat restoration and have supported the modernization of conveyance in the Delta, and also supported the creation of the Delta Stewardship Council and Delta Reform Act. We appreciate the work the staff has done putting into these draft amendments. Many make important clarifications to the appeal procedures with the aim of making them clear, efficient, and fair. And we also appreciate the opportunity to comment at the workshop and staff's plan to circulate for further comments down the line. And the reason we're commenting today is to call your attention to several of our comments that weren't really highlighted in the staff summary, but really go to the heart of the appeal process. Both the existing appeal procedures and the proposed amendments to Rule 29, which is the rule allowing for requests for official notice of evidence. This is not an augmentation of the administrative record, but a request for official notice of evidence that's not in the administrative record. The existing procedures and the amendments would allow admission of what's really irrelevant evidence under that official notice procedure. And that's out of keeping with a long line of California court cases interpreting the exact same substantial evidence standard of review that's in the Delta Reform Act. And under the Act, the only question before the council on an appeal is whether the certification is supported by substantial evidence in the record that was before the agency when it submitted its certification. And under a landmark California Supreme Court case on the substantial evidence standard that's cited in our comment letter, the court held that evidence outside the record, this so-called extra record evidence, is irrelevant to the question before the agency, which is whether the evidence that's in the record is substantial or not, or whether the record is simply lacking evidence. So based on this, our request is that the council either repeal Rule 29 or that the rule be modified so that it places a burden on the party seeking official notice to show that the evidence is relevant to the substantial evidence question and that it qualifies for one of the judicially recognized very narrow exceptions to the default rule against the admissibility of extra record evidence. And for the same reason, State Water Contractors recommends that Rule 11B be clarified to avoid suggesting that the council must consider all evidence that's presented at the hearing, even extra record evidence, and instead focus on relevance and the council's duty to exclude irrelevant extra record evidence during the hearing procedure to keep the council focused on its statutory mandate to review the record to see if it has substantial evidence to support the agency's certification or not. The remainder of our comments are detailed in the letter, but to flag just three, first, we think Rule 12C should be modified to state that if the certifying agency inadvertently misses or misunderstands an argument that in its response brief, that does not relieve the appellant of its burden of proving a lack of substantial evidence in the record. Because when you have multiple appeals, it's very difficult sometimes to even understand what the arguments are you're responding to. So it's possible that an agency respond, miss the target, and then there shouldn't be a gotcha in that process saying, well, you didn't respond, so we're going to grant the appeal. Second, when deciding multiple appeals of the same covered action, the council, we think, should hold at least one public hearing or workshop on the staff's draft determination before it meets to take final action, so it has the opportunity to give staff direction. And finally, there should be an outer limit of 60 days on any mutually agreed extension of time to issue a final determination on appeal. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. We look forward to further engagement on these important amendments.
Thank you, Robert. Beth, next speaker.
Next, we have Antonio Alfaro.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, Antonio, we can hear you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and Council members. Antonio Alfaro, Government Relations Manager with the Santa Clara Valley Water District, also known as Valley Water. We are both a Central Valley Project and State Water Project contractor. Valley Water has invested millions in expanding and improving local water supplies, while also increasing water conservation. Our public drought awareness campaign has led to one of the highest rates of water conservation in the state. We are taking an all of the above approach to water supply for the future prosperity of Silicon Valley. Valley Water previously commented on the rules governing the appeals consistency determination on March 7th, 2022. Our comments align with those made by the Department of Water Resources and the state water contractors. However, the substance of our comments is not included in staff summary of the comments received on the proposed rule changes. Section 85225 of the Delta Reform Act requires projects with impacts to imported water supplies to adopt and certify a consistency determination with detailed factual findings to determine if the covered action is consistent with the Delta Plan. Valley Water's principal concern is the manner in which the appeals procedures apply the substantial evidence standard. When a consistency determination is appealed, the Delta Reform Act requires the council to determine whether the consistency determination is supported by substantial evidence. First, the substantial evidence standard does not require nor allow the Delta Stewardship Council to act as a neutral fact finder by inviting parties or the general public or Delta Protection Commission to submit evidence or testimony that was not before the certifying local agency. Its role is to impartially review the record before the certifying agency and determine its adequacy. Its role is, in essence, to act similar to a court of appeal in reviewing the evidence presented before the trial court prior to its decision. Valley Water urges the council to avoid any invitation of extra record evidence in its proposed changes to rules 10, 11, and 29. Relying on extra record evidence in determining whether to sustain or overrule an appeal of a consistency determination may be grounds for a court to invalidate its action. Second, the substantial evidence standard of review is a well-established legal standard that affords deference to the administrating agency's determination. This means that if a competent factual findings support the agency's consistency determination, the agency's consistency determination should be upheld, even if there was also other facts and evidence before the agency that would have supported an opposite finding. Legally, this is what substantial evidence review means, and it is what the legislature intended. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you today to provide you with our comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Beth, next speaker.
Next, we have Brian Barnhart, who's with us in person today.
Great.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Okay. Madam Chair, Your Honor, members of the council, I am Brian Barnhart from the Department of Water Resources, Office of General Counsel, and I'm here to express support and appreciation for the work that has been put into these procedures so far. More work remains to be done, but things are definitely progressing on the right track. We appreciate and support the council's decision to revise these appellate procedures. We appreciate the opportunity to comment. We appreciate the council's thoughtful responses to our comments so far. And we look forward to the next draft and look forward to the opportunity to appreciate the opportunity to comment some more. Specifically, we wanted to come and voice support for the council's interpretation of the proper role of the Delta Protection Commission within the appellate procedures of the council, specifically as it relates to the appellate function of the council. The Delta Protection Commission does not enjoy any sort of privileged status. If the Delta Protection Commission wishes to participate in the appellate process, then they need to comply with the same appellate procedures that apply to everybody else. Clearly, the Delta Reform Act gives this council the authority and the power to control its own appellate procedures. In order for those appellate procedures to operate efficiently and fairly to everyone, all parties need to follow the same procedural rules. And they need to present their arguments and they need to present their evidence in the same order. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Brian. Beck, next speaker.
Next, we have Bruce Blodgett. I have a Bruce B, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Coming through okay?
Perfectly, Bruce.
Perfect. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the council. This is Bruce Blodgett with the Delta Protection Commission. We've been getting referenced here a few times and with some comments. And I think a good exercise is to go back and look at those comments that are in your packet. Couple things here. The Delta Reform Act authorized the commission to provide comments and recommendations to the council on any significant project that may affect the unique values of the Delta. The comment authority granted to the commission is not limited to issues raised by appellates, but rather include the following. One of those, the identification of impacts to cultural, recreation, and agricultural values of the Delta. 2, recommendations for actions that may avoid, reduce, or mitigate impacts to the cultural, recreation, and ag values of the Delta. 3, review the consistency of a project with the commission's resource management plan and the Delta plan. 4, identification and recommendation of methods to address Delta community concerns regarding large-scale habitat plan development and implementation. As we look at this, we also look and we'll be relying heavily on our economic sustainability plan. And it is the council that has the opportunity that if we provide specific recommendations, if they're valid recommendations, if they're feasible and consistent with the Delta plan, then they should be adopted. That's the role that's been outlined by the legislature. That was the role that's been given, between the Delta Protection Act and in the Delta Reform. Those are the authorities granted to us. So I won't take up any more of your time. Our comments are in here. We look forward to working with the council and the staff moving forward on improvements that'll work for everybody, including Delta residents.
Thank you, Bruce. Beck, next speaker.
That concludes our public comment at this time.
Okay. Again, I just want to thank all of our speakers. Let me just tell you personally, from my perspective, all of your concerns are duly noted. And again, appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your comments and thoughts on this very important topic. Bring it back to the council. I know that Councilmember Natoli, you wanted to wait after the speakers for you to share some thoughts, perspective, and some words.
Good. Thank you, Chairman Dueño. Certainly thanks to Jeff and Eva and all those that have worked on this. Obviously, this has been a work in progress for a good deal of time. And obviously over the course of this calendar year, there's been a good deal of comments submitted as well as additional work. And so I know that as a member of this council, I'm appreciative, but certainly on behalf of the Delta Protection Commission, again, we want to express our thanks to the level of, I think, of consideration given to all the commentors, but certainly to those that submitted by the commission. The last two speakers, I think, spoke to, again, from different perspectives, the role of the Delta Protection Commission, and that was embodied as our executive director, Mr. Blodgett, referenced in the letter that we submitted to the council staff back in January. I wanted to be very clear that was actually a matter that was presented to the commission itself, and the commission actually, through the proper procedures, exercised a vote on that, and so it was submitted through the chair in my current role, but was presented to the commission and explored relative to some of the concerns, but also what was being under consideration at the time. And I know there's been work that's been done subsequent to that, so certainly want to respect that. One of the, I think, core issues, though, and goes to the comment authority that's granted to the commission and how that obviously coincides or fits in with the appeals procedure that this council, through its authorities, establishes. And I'm not an attorney, so I certainly don't the qualifications to speak to. We have obviously counsel with us here. We have counsel at the commission. We've heard from counsel from Department of Water Resources and from other commentors. But I think it's really important because some of this is embedded in the Delta Reform Act, more current legislation, but it goes back to Delta Protection Act and the commission's role that was established at that time, some 30 years ago, and obviously more recently in the last dozen years with the Reform Act. I think it's entirely appropriate that this council, from time to time, through the process we're utilizing right now, takes the opportunity to draw upon the experience of appeals, again, because I think legislatively and in theory, things are structured in a way that would provide for a fair process, but it's in practice that you actually learn how those things are applied. But I think the core issue here is certainly, as our title states, the Delta Protection Commission has that role, and certainly to do our utmost to reflect the concerns of Delta interests, some of those obviously being the people who live there, work there, conduct their activities there, and recognizing that our construct and structure is through the legislative action that established us. And so in respect of that, I guess I would just note, and again, I don't know whether Commission Council has worked with the council, councils of the council, but I think it's really important because, again, there's a unique role here. It's not to be outside of any appeals process, not to disadvantage or advantage any of the appellants, nor certainly to advantage the commission. But we have a very important role, and I think as a voice, and again, respecting the authorities of this council, ultimately to make a determination as to how our recommendation or comments would fit in with both the Delta Plan and the Delta Protection Act, and then that would be applied obviously to the specific matter before this body. And I think the concern that was expressed in the letter, and I would just reiterate today, is respecting the process is being established and that's being considered here and refinements to that, but also respecting the voice of the commission, long established, and I think should be given the due consideration, and not outside of the process, but should be given due consideration and allow commission to comment beyond what might be the specifics of the appeal on those aspects. And they're detailed in the letter, so I don't want to be redundant here, but the important aspects of the Delta, the cultural, recreational, agricultural values of the Delta, and there's some other references as well. And we do have plans that we've had to adopt and that have to be consistent with the Delta Plan, the Land Use and Resource Management Plan, done economic sustainability studies, which are called for legislatively, but certainly inform our plans, but hopefully the council activities as well. So as we go forward, without getting into detailed specific recommendations, I guess that's where the concern lies, is that the structure and how we would be integrated into that, and whether it's, I guess, for lack of a better description, the limitations are so strict as to limit the ability of the commission at the point in time that there are appeals before this body in its review and consideration, in respecting the broader structure that established the commission, his role, and with respect to this council, and certainly to the appellants to any action and or other interested parties. And so I guess I would just call upon this council as we consider this, and this is a workshop today. And again, I appreciate it. I know Jeff and even certainly Jessica all have, given this a lot of thought, but I think that is a consideration that that our commission, again, directed through its communication through its chair, to be sure that we address that. And I think it goes back to the core reason why, one of the core reasons why the commission exists, and that is to be an effective voice for the Delta, certainly to be respectful of other state and other processes, but also to provide the highest level of assurance that those voices are heard as communicated through commission's appropriate role in this process. So I would just leave it at that for right now. I don't know if Jeff or Eva, if you would want to comment on that. Again, there's a bit of a tension, maybe even built into the statutes, and again, with their and that's part of today's discussion. But to sum it all up, I think that I want to express concerns that we not be limited as a commission to the extent that, you know, is so structured that we aren't able to draw upon one, the expertise, but our own planning documents that integrate with the Delta plan, and to be able to express those appropriately at the appropriate time in the process. And I would just leave it with that. And again, hopefully I was clear enough, but trying to be concise here, recognizing this is a workshop. And again, with all due respect to certainly all the parties that are working on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Natoli. Again, given my limited views on the screen, not being in person, looking to see if there are additional questions from Councilmember Zingali, who I got on the phone before we go to the other members.
No questions right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Zingali. Councilmember Lee, Councilmember Damrell, any questions from you?
No.
Okay. Councilmember Lee? No. Okay. Well, this is a public workshop. We are not actually calling for any action at this particular time. I would like to just say a couple of things. And Councilmember Natoli, I truly can acknowledge and empathize and wholeheartedly share in what you just shared. The Delta Protection Commission is a unique body. In my opinion, yes, you are the voice for so many who live and work in the Delta. And again, that's why I do believe that it's so important for all of us, especially myself, to get out there and learn and hear and appreciate more from the Delta communities. And so again, as I go out and do my tours to speak with members of the community, speak to members or business owners, I should say, and hear how the Delta really does affect its way of doing business, how it affects those that are fishing to be able to sustain themselves for recreation. It's important. So I think that, again, your comments are really important. And so I, again, really appreciate your thoughts, as well as all of those who have taken the time to share with us your perspective, your comments, and your opinions on where we are at this point. I'm now going to turn it over to Jeff. And Jeff, if you can clarify next steps for us and how we proceed from this point forward.
Mike.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'll just first off thank everyone for their comments today, and all of it very well received, and look forward to responding in a revised draft. I guess at this point I would look to the council, staff will look to the council for direction with regard to whether to conduct an additional workshop or whether to proceed with a revised version of the appeals procedures. Again, our staff recommendation is the latter, which is we believe that we're in a good place with having received and heard the various different comments today, as well as in the draft letters that or the final letters that we received in March, and are prepared to further revise the appeals procedures, circulate those for public review, and bring them back to a future council meeting for consideration of approval. So that is the staff recommendation, should the council so direct.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Given that this is a information item, I'm going to look to legal too. We don't need for a motion. Is that correct? We just need or do we need a motion?
To be safe, I would proceed with a motion, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Make a motion.
Yes, Councilmember Lee.
I motion that we direct staff to revise the current draft of the proposed amended appeals procedures and bring them back to the council for consideration and potential adoption at a future public council meeting.
Very good. There's been a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
I'll second.
Okay. It was seconded by Councilmember Damrell, I believe. I think he came first. So motion and second again by Lee and by Damrell.
Question, Madam Chair, to the motion.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Member Natoli, I have a question on the motion.
Yes. Yes.
So if I understood Jeff's presentation then on what we might consider, and if it was the intent of the motion, that taking into consideration the comments that we've received thus far, those that were put on the record today, they may very well be reflected, because what we're doing now is not necessarily blessing what was before us today. Would take those into consideration, and that would be what would be coming back to us. Whatever changes from a staff perspective you might bring may or may not reflect the comments we've heard here today, but you're going to take those things into consideration.
That's consistent with our understanding.
Okay. And if I could just a question of council, because both the commission and the Stewardship Council are advised by obviously representatives from the Attorney General's office. Is there opportunity, because there seems to be some difference and maybe at the broader level staff, but our staff at the commission and the staff here have a little different take on how this fits into the appeals process, with some of us based upon interpretations. And I heard Mr. Barnhart as well, from the Department of Water Resources, what their take on it was. Again, you can have as many different opinions as you maybe have councils, but I'm just wondering, or if it would be advantageous and appropriate for commission council to talk with the Stewardship Council. It might help with some of the staff work that will go on. Mr. Blodgett's certainly in his capacity is relatively new to that position, and but I would just, again, I would ask that maybe of Jessica too, if that would be helpful for folks to look at. It's not purely just based, but it has to be legal. But secondly, then how this council would decide how we want to apply that. So I wanted to be understanding of that, if I could, Jorge.
That's a good idea, Councilman Natoli. And I think I for my part, I'm happy to talk to anybody. I know they're represented by the Attorney General's office, so the representative is welcome to talk to me, just to touch base on legal issues and have a frank exchange of what can be done. Okay, and again, if appropriate, maybe Jessica, in talking with Mr. Blodgett and working with our respective staffs. Obviously, he has folks that advise him in the context of all this. And I come at it from the fact that our commission did weigh in, and with abstentions, so duly noted from state members of that agency, but certainly the other 9 commission members voted to send a correspondence. Things have evolved over time, but I want to be assured that maybe we spend time appropriately so that the next time it comes back, hopefully there's general agreement around the process going forward. So.
Thank you, Councilmember Natoli. I think those are great points of clarity.
Put somebody to sleep. Sorry.
You putting us to sleep, never. No, I think that you've highlighted some good areas for us to focus on and move forward. And again, just to reiterate, the motion has been put forward by Councilmember Lee. It's been seconded by Councilmember Damrell. And I will now ask Beck if you wouldn't mind taking roll call, since it is now a vote.
Absolutely. I'm just going to go in the order I see you. Councilmember Natoli.
Aye.
Councilmember Lee.
Aye.
Councilmember Damrell. Councilmember Damrell.
Aye.
Councilmember Medueno.
Aye.
Councilmember Zangali.
Aye.
Motion is approved. Wonderful. Thank you, Beck. Okay, that concludes that portion of the workshop. We will now conclude this meeting. The next council meeting is scheduled for October the 27th, possibly 28th at the CNRA headquarters. Please refer to the posted meeting notice 10 days before the meeting for further information or updates. Again, thank you, everybody. Be safe, and I look forward to seeing you in October, if not sooner. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you. Ditto.